My name is Sarah. I am 33 years old, a former Navy Fleet Marine Force corpsman, and currently an ER trauma nurse in Florida. I earned the Navy Cross in Afghanistan by pulling 3 Marines out of a burning Humvee, but my toughest battle was not in a war zone. It was in a family courtroom. Just months after I carried my sister-in-law's son out of a burning boat and nearly died saving him, she sued me for custody interference. In court, the judge sneered and ordered my medal removed. But when my attorney opened a sealed Navy file, the entire courtroom learned exactly why he had targeted me, and the gavel came crashing down on his own career. Before I tell you how that disgraced judge lost everything and how I took back my life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you believe that real heroes do not wear capes. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. I love hearing from you all. Now, let me take you back to the day the fire started. Growing up, I was always the reliable one. While my older brother David, who is now 35, bounced from one unfinished degree to another, I enlisted in the Navy. I wanted discipline. I wanted a purpose. After my deployment and medical discharge, I used my GI Bill to become a nurse, settling into a quiet, structured life in Tampa. David, on the other hand, married Chloe. Chloe is 30 years old, and she operates under the firm belief that the world, and our family in particular, owes her a luxury lifestyle she refuses to work for. To Chloe, I was not a sister. I was a free babysitter, an emergency ATM, and a convenient backup plan. When David maxed out his credit cards to buy Chloe a designer handbag for their anniversary, I was the one who paid their electric bill so their power would not get shut off in the middle of July. When Chloe decided she needed a mental health week at a spa to recover from the stress of being a stay-at-home mother, I burned my vacation days to watch their son. I never said no because saying no meant abandoning my nephew Leo. Leo is 5 years old with a mop of curly brown hair and a laugh that can brighten the darkest rooms. He is the absolute light of my life. I would sit on the floor with him for hours building elaborate Lego castles, while Chloe sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, complaining about how small their house was compared to her friends. David always defended her. He would say she was sensitive and needed a certain standard of living to feel secure. I bit my tongue and paid their overdue water bill. I justified my sacrifices by telling myself I was being a good aunt. I told myself that family steps up. In the military, you never leave a man behind. I applied that same loyalty to my brother and his wife. I worked 60-hour weeks in the emergency room, dealing with trauma, blood, and tears, only to spend my days off fixing David's leaky sink or buying groceries for Chloe because she blew their budget on expensive cosmetic treatments. My parents were no help. They were retired and living on a fixed income, but they idolized David. He was their golden boy who could do no wrong. Whenever I tried to set a boundary, my mother would call me, her voice dripping with guilt. She would say I was single, I had no children of my own, and I should be happy to help my brother build his family. I was conditioned to accept that my needs were secondary. My money, my time, and my energy existed merely to subsidize Chloe's delusions of grandeur. But the absolute devotion I had for Leo made it all bearable. He would run to the door when I came over, wrapping his little arms around my knees, shouting that Aunt Sarah was here. For him, I would have walked through fire. And on one suffocatingly hot weekend in September, I literally did. I should have known something was wrong the moment David and Chloe invited me on their boat for the Labor Day weekend. They never invited me anywhere unless they needed me to pay for the meal or watch Leo while they drank. The boat itself was a point of deep contention. It was a 28-foot fiberglass cruiser they could absolutely not afford. David had financed it at a terrible interest rate, claiming they needed it to network with wealthier couples. I knew for a fact they were 3 months behind on the slip fee at the marina because the marina manager had accidentally called me looking for David. When I arrived at the dock that Saturday morning, Chloe was wearing a pristine white swimsuit and a wide-brimmed hat holding a mimosa in a plastic flute. She looked like she was staging a photo shoot for social media. David was struggling to get the engine started, cursing under his breath. I almost turned around and went back to my car. I had just finished a brutal 12-hour night shift, and every bone in my body ached. But then, I saw Leo sitting in the cabin below deck, wearing his oversized orange life jacket, waving at me through the small window. My exhaustion melted away. I stepped onto the boat, unaware that I was walking directly into a trap that would cost me my savings, my peace, and very nearly my life. The water was calm as we headed out into the bay. The Florida sun was beating down, reflecting off the water in blinding flashes. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. David drove the boat, trying to look like a wealthy yacht owner. Chloe sat at the bow, taking endless selfies, completely ignoring her son. I went down into the small cabin with Leo. We were playing a card game matching animals and eating peanut butter sandwiches I had packed because Chloe forgot to bring any real food. The cabin was cramped and smelled faintly of gasoline, which David had brushed off as a normal boat smell when I mentioned it earlier. We were anchored about 2 miles off the coast. The water was deep and dark blue. I was just dealing a new hand of cards when I heard David shout from the deck above. It was not a casual shout. It was a sharp, terrified scream that made my military training instantly kick in. I stood up, hitting my head on the low ceiling, just as a deafening boom ripped through the air. The force of the explosion knocked me off my feet, throwing me against the wooden bulkhead. The sound was like a bomb going off in a tin can. Thick, choking black smoke instantly filled the cabin. The smell of burning fiberglass and melting plastic was overpowering. I scrambled to my hands and knees, coughing wildly. The heat was immediate and oppressive. I looked up the short stairwell leading to the deck. Orange flames were already licking at the entryway, blocking the path. I yelled for David. I yelled for Chloe. There was no answer. Through the roar of the fire, I heard the distinct splash of 2 bodies hitting the water outside. They had jumped. They had jumped to safety without even calling out for their 5-year-old son. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my chest. I turned around in the smoke-filled cabin. Leo was backed into the furthest corner, huddled under the small dining table, screaming my name. His eyes were wide with absolute terror. The flames were spreading impossibly fast, consuming the upholstery and the wooden paneling. The heat was blistering. In the Navy, they teach you how to remain calm in a crisis, but nothing prepares you for the sight of a child you love trapped in an inferno. I crawled toward him, keeping my head low to avoid the thickest smoke. My arms brushed against a burning cushion, and I felt the fabric of my shirt scorch the heat searing into my skin. I ignored the pain. I reached under the table and grabbed Leo by his life jacket, dragging him tightly to my chest. He buried his face in my shoulder, sobbing hysterically. The stairs were fully engulfed in flames now. The fire had spread across the deck above us. We were trapped. I knew that if we stayed in the cabin for another 30 seconds, the smoke would kill us before the fire even reached us. I had to get us out. I wrapped my arms completely around Leo, shielding his head and body with my own torso. I took one deep breath of the cleanest air I could find near the floor, closed my eyes, and charged up the burning stairs. The pain was indescribable. It felt like walking through a solid wall of agony. The flames licked at my arms, my back, and my neck. I felt my hair singe and my skin blister. My throat burned with every step, but I did not stop. I could not stop. I burst through the wall of fire and stumbled onto the deck. The entire back half of the boat was consumed by flames. The engine compartment was a raging inferno. Without pausing to assess the damage, I ran to the edge of the boat, clutching Leo so tightly, my arms shook and threw us both overboard into the cold, dark water. The impact knocked the breath out of me, but the sudden cold provided a shocking, momentary relief to the agonizing burns on my back and arms. I kicked my legs, surfacing quickly. Leo was sputtering, but breathing. His life jacket kept him afloat. I grabbed the collar of his jacket and treaded water, pulling him away from the burning boat, which was now beginning to list heavily to one side. I looked around frantically, expecting to see David and Chloe swimming toward us, screaming for their son. I expected to see 2 parents frantic with worry. Instead, I saw them about 50 yards away. They had swum to the nearest channel marker buoy and were clinging to it. I swam toward them, dragging Leo with me. Every movement of my arms sent waves of excruciating pain through my body. The salt water burned into my open wounds like acid. I gritted my teeth and kept kicking, driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate need to get Leo to safety. A passing fishing boat had seen the smoke and was speeding toward us. They pulled David and Chloe out of the water first, then they circled around and threw a life ring to me. When the fishermen hauled me onto their deck, my legs finally gave out. I collapsed onto the wet fiberglass boards, gasping for air. Leo was crying, but the fisherman checked him over and confirmed he was completely unharmed. Not a single burn, not a single scratch. My body had taken the entirety of the fire. The pain was setting in now, radiating from my back and arms in blinding, nauseating waves. I knew enough about trauma to recognize that I had severe second and third degree burns. I was going into shock. I lay there shivering uncontrollably while the fisherman radioed for the Coast Guard and an ambulance. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the shock of what I saw next. As the fishing boat docked at the marina, paramedics were already waiting on the pier with stretchers. They rushed onto the boat and began assessing me, cutting away my burned shirt and applying cool, sterile dressings to my skin. I was drifting in and out of a haze of pain, but I turned my head to look for my brother and sister-in-law. I needed to see them holding Leo. I needed to know they were comforting him. Through the chaos of flashing ambulance lights and shouting first responders, I saw Chloe standing on the wooden dock. She was completely uninjured. Her hair was still perfectly styled, though a little wet. She was not holding Leo. She was not running toward the stretcher to check on me, the woman who had just walked through fire to save her child. Instead, Chloe was standing off to the side, furious and intensely focused. She was aggressively texting on her phone. She looked annoyed, as if the explosion had merely ruined her afternoon plans. She did not glance at the sinking remnants of her boat. She did not look at her weeping son, who was wrapped in a blanket in the arms of a police officer. And she did not look at me as they loaded my broken, burned body into the back of the ambulance. Right then, as the paramedic closed the ambulance doors, a cold realization settled over me, chilling me deeper than the shock. This was no accident, and the fire that nearly killed us was only the beginning of the nightmare. Waking up in a burn unit is not like waking up from a normal surgery. There is no gentle haze of anesthesia wearing off. There is only fire. Even though the flames on the boat had been extinguished, my body still believed it was burning. I spent the next 3 weeks trapped in a sterile white room at Tampa General Hospital, enveloped in a cocoon of bandages and unyielding agony. The doctors diagnosed me with severe second and third degree burns across my back, my shoulders, and both of my arms. Every movement was a battle against my own skin. The daily debridement procedures, where nurses had to scrub the dead tissue from my wounds to prevent infection, were a special kind of hell. I would bite down on a rolled-up towel to keep from screaming, gripping the metal bed rails until my knuckles turned white. But the physical pain was secondary to the crushing anxiety I felt for Leo. Leo was in the pediatric intensive care unit 3 floors below me. He had inhaled a dangerous amount of toxic smoke, and the searing heat had caused severe damage to his vocal cords and upper respiratory tract. He needed specialized pediatric burn care, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and a series of delicate skin grafts on his legs, where the melting fiberglass had dripped onto him, before I could reach him. I demanded daily updates from the nurses. I needed to know my nephew was surviving. I needed to know my sacrifice meant something. What I did not expect was how quickly my family would turn his tragedy into a digital spectacle. While I was confined to my bed, fighting off fevers and infections, Chloe was busy curating her trauma for the internet. She never came into my room. Not once. She claimed the smell of the burn unit triggered her PTSD from the explosion, but she was remarkably resilient when it came to holding her smartphone. From my hospital bed, I watched her daily updates on social media. She would post perfectly filtered photos of herself sitting in the hospital waiting room, looking impeccably disheveled. She wore oversized sweaters, her makeup carefully applied to make her look pale and exhausted. Her captions were masterclasses in emotional manipulation. She wrote about the nightmare of nearly losing her only child, the agonizing wait in the hospital corridors, and the unbearable burden of being a mother, holding her family together through a catastrophe. She never mentioned me. She never mentioned that she had jumped off the boat and left her son to burn. She never mentioned the aunt who had walked through a wall of fire to drag him out. According to her narrative, Leo's survival was a miracle granted solely to a devoted mother. Within 48 hours of the accident, Chloe launched a GoFundMe campaign. The title read, "Help Baby Leo Recover from Tragic Fire." The donations poured in. Friends, extended family, and hundreds of strangers touched by her poetic descriptions of a mother's grief opened their wallets. I watched the total climb past $20,000, then $30,000, then $50,000. I felt a brief wave of relief, thinking that at least Leo's astronomical medical bills would be covered. I was dead wrong. Wrong. At the end of my first week in the hospital, a financial counselor came to my room. She had a thick folder of Leo's medical invoices. She looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight as she stood at the foot of my bed. She explained that David and Chloe's insurance had denied the initial claim for Leo's emergency transport and specialized respiratory treatments. When the hospital billing department approached Chloe for a deposit to schedule Leo's first essential skin graft, Chloe had flatly refused. She told the billing department that she was too emotionally devastated to handle financial paperwork and directed them to speak with me. I demanded that a nurse bring my brother to my room. When David finally walked in, he looked everywhere except at my bandaged body. He stared at the floor, shifting uncomfortably. I asked him why the hospital was coming to me for his son's medical bills when they had just raised $50,000 online. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. He told me that Chloe needed that money for her mental health recovery. He said the explosion had shattered her sense of security, and she was using the GoFundMe donations to secure a trauma therapist, a life coach, and a series of holistic wellness retreats to process her grief. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. I asked him how he could possibly justify funding his wife's spa days while his 5-year-old son was waiting for skin grafts. David immediately went on the defensive. His voice took on that familiar, patronizing tone he always used when protecting Chloe. He said I was being rigid and unfeeling. He told me Chloe was emotionally fragile, far more delicate than I was. He said I was military, that I was used to trauma, but Chloe was breaking under the pressure. He actually had the audacity to look at my 3rd-degree burns and tell me that Chloe's invisible wounds were just as severe and that I needed to step up and help my family financially because I was the only one who had the means to do it. He knew exactly what means he was talking about. 2 months prior, I had received a substantial back pay settlement from the Department of Veterans Affairs for a service-connected disability claim I had been fighting for over 3 years. It was a lump sum meant to secure my future, a financial cushion I had earned through my own blood and service. David knew about that money, and now he and his wife were holding their own son's medical care hostage, knowing perfectly well that I would never let Leo suffer. They were betting on my love for my nephew to cover their responsibilities while they pocketed the charity of strangers. I told David to get out of my room. I did not yell. I did not cry. The betrayal was so profound it burned hotter than the physical wounds covering my back. I asked the nurse to bring me my laptop. With shaking hands wrapped heavily in gauze, I logged into my banking portal. The bright screen illuminated the dark, quiet hospital room. I looked at the balance in my savings account. It was the security blanket I had built over years of grueling emergency room shifts and the hard-fought VA settlement. It was my down payment for a house. It was my future. I did not hesitate. I authorized a direct wire transfer of $45,000 to the pediatric surgical department to cover Leo's skin grafts, his hyperbaric chamber sessions, and his upcoming physical therapy. I drained my savings entirely. Watching the numbers in my account drop to near zero was terrifying, but the thought of Leo lying in a sterile room, denied medical care because his mother wanted to attend wellness retreats, was unbearable. I paid the ransom. I secured my nephew's treatment, knowing full well I was being extorted by my own blood. Leo's surgeries were a success. He was a resilient, brave little boy, and the pediatric team worked miracles on his burns. As the days bled into weeks, my own recovery progressed agonizingly slowly. I learned to walk again without tearing the grafts on my legs. I learned to tolerate the intense, pulling sensation of healing skin across my back. Through it all, the silence from my brother and sister-in-law was deafening. They never thanked me for the $45,000. They treated it as an expected transaction, a duty I owed them simply for existing in their orbit. Then came the day of my discharge. The doctors cleared me to leave the hospital, but with strict instructions. I could not return to my physically demanding job as an emergency room nurse for at least 3 months. I required daily dressing changes, assistance with basic tasks, and a sterile living environment. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator. I could barely lift a gallon of milk, let alone carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs. David offered to let me stay in their guest room. At the time, I foolishly thought it was a gesture of familial guilt. I thought perhaps they realized the magnitude of what I had sacrificed and wanted to help me heal. I packed my meager belongings from the hospital room and waited in a wheelchair by the main entrance for David to pick me up. When the automatic doors slid open, I expected to see David's beat-up sedan. Instead, a brand new midnight blue Lexus SUV pulled up to the curb. The paint was so pristine it reflected the Florida sun like a mirror. The passenger window rolled down, revealing Chloe behind the wheel. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a customized iced coffee. I stared at the luxury vehicle, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of what I was looking at. David got out of the passenger side and helped me into the back seat. The interior smelled of rich, untouched leather. It was a $90,000 vehicle. As I settled into the back seat, wincing in pain as the seatbelt pressed against my bandaged shoulder, I asked Chloe exactly how they had afforded a luxury car when they were 3 months behind on their marina slip fees. Chloe adjusted her rearview mirror and sighed deeply as if my question was incredibly taxing. She told me she had used the GoFundMe money. She said the explosion had left her deeply traumatized by their previous vehicles, and her therapist had recommended she surround herself with an environment that felt safe and secure. She looked at me through the mirror and said without a trace of irony or shame that she simply needed reliable transport for her trauma, and that a mother dealing with a recovering child could not be expected to break down on the side of the road in a cheap car. She had taken the charity money donated by people who thought they were saving a burned child, and she had driven straight to a luxury dealership. Meanwhile, the woman who had actually saved that child was sitting in her back seat, bankrupt, broken, and wrapped in bandages. I did not argue with her. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window and closed my eyes, letting the vibration of the expensive engine numb my thoughts. Arguing with Chloe was like pouring water into a bottomless pit. She possessed a terrifying ability to victimize herself in any scenario, bending reality until it validated her absolute selfishness. When we arrived at their house, the true nature of their invitation became glaringly apparent. The guest room they had offered me was not a sanctuary for healing. It was a staging area for my new unpaid job. Leo had been discharged 2 days before me. He required complex, round-the-clock medical care. His bandages needed to be changed twice a day using sterile techniques. He needed specific physical therapy exercises to ensure his healing skin did not contract and limit his mobility. He needed medications administered at precise intervals. David and Chloe had not hired a home health nurse. They had brought me home because I was a trained medical professional, and more importantly, because I was free. Despite my own agonizing pain, despite the fact that I was supposed to be resting and recovering from massive trauma, I immediately fell into a routine of caring for Leo. I would wake up at 6 in the morning, gritting my teeth against the fire in my own back to prepare his medications. I spent hours sitting on the floor with him, turning the excruciating physical therapy exercises into games so he would not cry. I changed his dressings with meticulous care, ensuring his grafts healed perfectly. Chloe would sleep until 10. She would emerge from her master bedroom in silk pajamas, step over the medical supplies I had organized in the living room, and complain about how exhausting her life had become. She would leave the house in her new Lexus to attend lunches with friends, complaining to anyone who would listen about the terrible burden of having a recovering child. I absorbed it all. I swallowed the rage and focused entirely on Leo. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was doing it for him because if I did not do it, no one would. I settled into the quiet, painful rhythm of being the live in-help, believing that the worst of the nightmare was behind us. I had paid the price both physically and financially, and now we were just dealing with the aftermath. I had no idea that my presence in their home was exactly what would lead me to the truth. I had no idea that living under their roof would give me a front row seat to a deception so monstrous it would shatter our family forever. 6 months crept by in a grueling cycle of sterile gauze, antiseptic ointments, and agonizing physical therapy. My life had shrunk to the 4 walls of my brother's guest room and the living room rug where I spent hours rehabilitating my 5-year-old nephew. Every morning at 8 o'clock, I would sit on the floor with Leo gently massaging and stretching his legs to ensure the newly grafted skin did not tighten and permanently restrict his movement. It was a heartbreaking process. Leo would grip my unburned forearm with his tiny hands biting his lip to keep from crying out. I would distract him with stories about the Navy, turning his stretches into a game of submarine maneuvers, swallowing my own physical agony. The 3rd degree burns across my back, and shoulders were still healing, and sitting on the floor sent sharp radiating spikes of pain down my spine. But I never let Leo see me wince. I had drained $45,000 of my veteran disability back pay to ensure he received these skin grafts, and I was determined to see him walk properly again. While Leo and I fought daily battles on the living room floor, his parents were completely absent from the trenches. David was supposedly working extra shifts to cover the household bills, though the mortgage notice I accidentally saw in the mail piled up unpaid. Chloe, meanwhile, treated her son's recovery as a minor inconvenience to her social calendar. She would sleep until mid-morning, emerge in her designer activewear, and breeze past us with a customized iced coffee in hand. She spent her days driving her brand-new Lexus SUV to lunch dates and wellness clinics, claiming she needed specialized treatments to process the severe emotional trauma of the boat explosion. She never once changed Leo's bandages. She never once helped him with his exercises. She simply left the heavy lifting to the aunt she viewed as a convenient, unpaid medical servant. I absorbed her neglect because abandoning Leo was simply not an option. I believed that focusing entirely on my nephew was the only way to survive the crushing reality of my family's exploitation. I had absolutely no idea that a much darker truth was waiting just on the other side of the kitchen wall. It happened on a humid Tuesday afternoon in early March. We had just finished a particularly exhausting physical therapy session, and Leo had finally drifted into a deep, much-needed sleep on the living room sofa. I covered him with a light blanket and walked quietly toward the kitchen to get a glass of water and take my own pain medication. The house was dead silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. As I stood at the sink, I noticed the heavy fire door leading to the attached garage was cracked open about an inch. David had come home early for his lunch break, and I assumed he was just grabbing something from his toolbox. I was about to call out and ask him to pick up more sterile saline solution on his way back to work, but the sound of Chloe's voice stopped me cold. It was not the breathy, delicate voice she used for her social media followers. It was a harsh, vicious hiss vibrating with absolute rage. I froze the glass of water midway to my mouth. I heard a heavy stack of papers slam down onto the hood of a car. Chloe was practically screaming, though she was trying to keep her volume contained. She demanded to know how an insurance investigator could possibly deny a claim on a completely destroyed vessel. She said the entire point of the comprehensive marine policy was to guarantee a payout in the event of a total catastrophic loss. David's voice trembled when he replied. He sounded terrified, pleading with her to keep her voice down. He read aloud from a document, his words echoing off the concrete walls of the garage. He said the marine forensic team had concluded their investigation of the sunken hull. The insurance company was denying the $150,000 claim because the investigator found clear evidence of suspicious accelerants near the battery terminal. David's voice cracked as he asked her why she had to use so much gasoline. He asked her if she realized what kind of trouble they were in now. I stopped breathing. The glass in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. My mind raced back to that sweltering Labor Day weekend, the faint smell of gasoline in the cramped cabin below deck, David struggling to start the engine, the deafening explosion that sounded like a bomb, the immediate wall of fire, the fact that they had both jumped into the water instantly completely uninjured, without even calling out for their son. Through the crack in the door, Chloe scoffed a sound dripping with condescension. She told David to stop acting like a coward. She said the mechanic she hired had explicitly told her that a marine electrical fire required a heavy flashpoint to look convincing. She aggressively reminded my brother that they were drowning in credit card debt, that the marina was about to seize the boat for unpaid slip fees, and that the $150,000 insurance check was their only way out. She said the plan was flawless until the insurance company decided to play hardball. Then, with a chilling lack of emotion, she complained that she went through all the trouble of making sure they were safely above deck before it ignited, and now it was all for nothing because some investigator found chemical residue on a fiberglass panel. David let out a miserable groan, asking what they were going to do about the police. Chloe sharply dismissed his panic, telling him the police did not care about a denied insurance claim as long as they played the part of the traumatized victims. She told him to get back to work and leave the financial maneuvering to her. The heavy garage door rattled on its tracks, opening to the driveway. I heard the engine of David's sedan start and quickly back out. A moment later, the Lexus engine roared to life as Chloe peeled out of the driveway, undoubtedly heading to another lunch date to complain about her stressful life. I stood paralyzed in the kitchen for a long time. The silence of the house pressed against my eardrums. My heart slammed against my ribs with such force it actually ached. The explosion was not an accident. It was not a tragic mechanical failure. It was a calculated, premeditated act of arson. My sister-in-law had intentionally torched a boat in the middle of the bay for a payout. She had poured accelerant into the engine compartment, knowing her 5-year-old son was sitting directly below deck. She had prioritized a luxury lifestyle over the life of her own child. And my brother, the boy I grew up with, the man I had sacrificed everything to help, had known about it and covered it up. They had let me walk through a literal inferno. They had let me drain my life savings to pay for the medical care their own greed had necessitated. The profound betrayal instantly burned away the physical pain in my back. The shock morphed into a cold, terrifying clarity. I was no longer the reliable, subservient sister. I was a former military medic who had just discovered an attempted murder. I set the water glass on the counter. I walked softly into the living room, ensuring Leah was still sound asleep. Then I walked directly into the master bedroom. The room was a mess of discarded designer clothes and expensive cosmetic bottles. Chloe was incredibly vain, but she was also incredibly lazy with her digital security. She had left her silver iPad charging on her nightstand. I picked it up. The screen illuminated, asking for a passcode. I knew Chloe viewed her life as a movie where she was the star, and I knew she used the same date for every password she had ever created. I typed in the date of her wedding anniversary. The device unlocked immediately. I did not have to dig very deep. Chloe believed she was smarter than everyone else, which made her sloppy. I bypassed her social media apps and went straight to her internet browser history. I scrolled back to late August, the week before the boating trip. The search queries were a glaring roadmap of criminal intent. She had searched for how to stage a marine electrical fire without getting caught. She had searched for the flashpoint of mixed gasoline in an enclosed hull. She had looked up average insurance payout timelines for total vessel loss. My hands shook with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. I opened her messaging app and went to the recently deleted folder an Apple feature she clearly did not know existed. There was a restored thread with an unsaved number simply labeled Ray. The messages were damning. Ray had instructed her on how to bypass the bilge pump alarm. Chloe had texted him a picture of a fuel-soaked rag wedged near the alternator belt, asking if it was positioned correctly to spark when the ignition turned over. Ray had replied with a thumbs-up emoji, telling her to make sure she was standing near the stern when it blew. I sank onto the edge of her plush mattress, staring at the glowing screen. She had orchestrated the entire event. She had intentionally placed the fuel. She had staged the explosion. She had nearly killed my nephew and me for $150,000. And then she had used the GoFundMe charity money raised from the accident to buy the luxury SUV she was currently driving. She was not just entitled and selfish. She was a sociopath. I knew exactly what I had to do. In the military, you gather your intelligence, you secure your perimeter, and you strike with overwhelming evidence. I used my own phone to take high-resolution photographs of every single search query, every text message, and the contact information for the mechanic named Ray. I documented the timestamps meticulously. I backed the photos up to 2 separate secure cloud drives. I was going to take this iPad bundle, Leo into my car, and drive straight to the federal authorities. Insurance fraud across state maritime lines was a federal offense, and child endangerment would put her away for decades. I placed the iPad gently back on the nightstand, exactly as I had found it. I walked back into the living room. Leo was just starting to stir, rubbing his sleepy eyes. I knelt beside him, brushing his curly hair back from his forehead. I told him we were going to go on a little adventure, just the 2 of us. He smiled, completely trusting me. I packed a small bag with his medical supplies, a change of clothes, and his favorite stuffed bear. I grabbed my car keys, adrenaline coursing through my veins. We were leaving this house and we were never coming back. I was going to end their reign of terror today. I reached for the front doorknob, completely prepared to march into a police precinct and burn my brother's life to the ground. But before my fingers could grasp the metal handle, the doorbell rang. The sharp chime echoed loudly through the foyer, making me jump. Leo clutched his bear tightly. I looked through the peephole. A man in a cheap, rumpled gray suit was standing on the porch holding a thick manila envelope. He did not look like a delivery driver. He had the tired, resigned posture of someone who delivered bad news for a living. I opened the door, just a few inches, keeping my body positioned between the stranger and my nephew. I asked him what he wanted. The man glanced down at a clipboard, then back up at me. He asked if I was Sarah Myers. I hesitated, my military instincts flaring, but I nodded curtly. The man sighed, thrust the heavy manila envelope through the crack in the door, and tapped the front of it with his pen. He stated formally that I had been served, then turned on his heel and walked quickly back to his sedan parked on the street. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. My hands felt unnaturally cold as I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents inside the envelope. I pulled the papers out. The bold, black text at the top of the first page leaped out at me. It was a summons to appear in civil court. I scanned down to the plaintiff section. The plaintiff was Chloe Myers. I flipped rapidly through the pages, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of the legal claims. Chloe was not just suing me. She was launching a massive coordinated legal strike. The document stated she was suing me for $500,000 in damages for reckless endangerment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and custody interference. The filing claimed that during the boat explosion, I had acted with negligent hero complex behavior, intentionally injuring Leo during the rescue to secure gratitude and financial control over the family. She was formally alleging that my presence in her home was a calculated attempt to alienate the affection of her son, and that I was a dangerous, unstable veteran who posed an immediate threat to her mental health. I stared at the paperwork, the air completely leaving my lungs. She had torched the boat, nearly murdered her own child, stolen my life savings, and now, before I could even expose her crimes, she was suing me for $500,000 to silence me and throw me out on the street. The conflict had just escalated from a family dispute into a brutal, high-stakes legal war. And as I looked at the signature of the sleazy personal injury attorney at the bottom of the page, I realized this was not just a frivolous lawsuit, it was an ambush. I stood in the foyer of my brother's house, staring at the thick stack of legal papers in my hands. The heavy manila envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The process server was already gone, his car disappearing down the suburban street, leaving me completely alone in the suffocating silence of the hallway. I walked slowly to the kitchen island, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, and spread the documents out across the granite countertop. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to mock me. It was a formal summons to appear in civil court. The plaintiff listed on the document was Chloe Myers. The defendant was me. I forced my eyes to focus on the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of what I was reading. Chloe was not just suing me. She was launching a coordinated scorched earth campaign to destroy my entire life. The lawsuit demanded $500,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. The charges listed were so absurd, so entirely disconnected from reality, that for a brief moment I actually thought it was a sick joke. She was suing me for reckless endangerment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and alienation of affection. I read the reckless endangerment section 3 times, my vision blurring with a mixture of disbelief and blinding rage. The legal filing claimed that during the boat explosion, I had acted with a negligent hero complex. Chloe's lawyer had literally written that I intentionally delayed getting Leo off the burning vessel to maximize the drama of the rescue. The document alleged that I had aggressively dragged my 5-year-old nephew through the flames, intentionally causing him unnecessary physical trauma, just so I could play the savior. She was accusing the woman who had sustained 3rd-degree burns shielding her son of child abuse. She claimed my military background had made me psychologically unstable, prone to manufacturing dangerous situations just to relive the adrenaline of a war zone. But the cruelty did not stop there. The second charge was intentional infliction of emotional distress. Chloe claimed that my severe burn injuries and my subsequent presence in her home were causing her profound psychological trauma. The lawsuit stated that watching me recover was a constant, deliberate reminder of the accident engineered by me to manipulate the family into feeling guilty. She was blaming me for the fact that she had to look at the burns I sustained while saving the child she had abandoned to the fire. The final charge, alienation of affection, was the most twisted of all. Chloe formally alleged that my daily routine of changing Leo's bandages and guiding him through his agonizing physical therapy was a calculated manipulation tactic. She claimed I was using medical care to brainwash her son, turning him against his own mother to satisfy my sad, empty life as a single, childless woman. She was using the countless hours I spent on the living room floor, soothing a crying child while she was out at the spa, as evidence of a malicious conspiracy to steal her family. I stood there in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly, my knuckles ached. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Chloe had intentionally torched the boat for a $150,000 insurance payout. When the insurance investigator found the accelerant and denied the claim, her perfect financial crime had collapsed. She and David were drowning in credit card debt. They were facing potential criminal charges for arson. They needed a massive influx of cash to save themselves, and they needed a scapegoat to take the blame for the trauma surrounding the fire. I was the perfect target. They knew I had recently received a substantial disability back pay settlement from the Veterans Affairs Department. They knew I was a disciplined saver. They looked at my life, at my sacrifices, at the burns covering my back, and they did not see a sister. They saw a bank vault waiting to be cracked. This lawsuit was not about emotional distress. It was an extortion attempt. They were trying to silence me, bankrupt me, and force me to hand over $500,000 to fund their luxury lifestyle and pay off the debts from their failed arson scheme. A cold, metallic calm washed over me. In the military, when you realize you have walked into an ambush, panic is the enemy. You do not freeze. You analyze the incoming fire, you identify the enemy positions, and you prepare to dismantle them. I carefully gathered the legal documents, sliding them back into the manila envelope. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had the iPad photographs proving Chloe researched how to stage a marine fire. I had the text messages to her shady mechanic. I had the truth. I just needed to gather my resources and prepare for war. But before I could even formulate a strategy to secure a lawyer, the front door rattled. A key turned in the lock, and the heavy oak door swung open. I expected to see David walking in from work. Instead, my mother and father stepped into the foyer. They were breathing heavily, their faces drawn and pale, carrying the distinct, frantic energy of a looming crisis. They did not take off their coats. They did not ask how my burn grafts were healing. They walked straight into the kitchen, their eyes locking onto the manila envelope resting on the counter. And in that moment, looking at the terrified, defensive postures of the two people who were supposed to protect me, I realized the betrayal was about to run much deeper than my sister-in-law. My mother reached out and touched the manila envelope, her hand trembling slightly. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with frantic, unshed tears. She told me she knew about the lawsuit. David had called them an hour ago in a panic, claiming I was tearing the family apart. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. I told my parents that David and Chloe were the ones suing me for $500,000 based on absolute lies. I started to explain what I had found on the iPad. I tried to tell them about the search history of the arson, the fact that Chloe had intentionally set the boat on fire for insurance money. My father held up his hand, cutting me off instantly. He squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head, refusing to hear the words. He told me to stop making wild accusations. He said the insurance company was just being difficult and that I was letting my anger cloud my judgment. My mother grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She did not want to hear about arson or attempted murder. She only cared about maintaining the fragile illusion of our perfect family. With a voice shaking with desperation, my mother begged me to just settle the lawsuit. She pleaded with me to give Chloe what she wanted. She actually looked me in the eye and suggested I use my military pension and my remaining savings to pay Chloe off. I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer insanity of her request. I asked her why in the world I would ever pay a ransom to a woman who had abandoned her child in a fire and was now trying to extort me. My mother burst into heavy, dramatic sobs. She cried that Chloe had given them an ultimatum. Chloe had threatened that if I fought the lawsuit in court, if I dragged her name through the mud, she would pack up Leo and move across the country. My mother wailed that she would never see her only grandson again. She framed it as a noble sacrifice. She told me I was strong, that I was used to hardship, but the family could not survive losing Leo. She was asking me to voluntarily accept the label of a child abuser, to surrender my financial future, and to let a sociopath walk away clean, just so she could still have a grandson to show off at holiday dinners. I looked at my father, waiting for him to step in, waiting for him to be the voice of reason. He simply stared at the floor, muttering that keeping the peace was the most important thing and that I could always earn the money back eventually. The reality of my entire existence in this family finally crystallized, sharp and undeniable. I was the scapegoat. I had always been the scapegoat. My purpose was to absorb the damage, pay the debts, and quietly disappear so the golden child and his wife could shine without consequence. My parents knew the lawsuit was fraudulent. They knew Chloe was a monster. But confronting that monster required courage they did not possess, so they chose to sacrifice me instead. I pulled my arm out of my mother's grasp. I stood incredibly straight, ignoring the sharp pull of the healing skin on my back. I looked at both of them and spoke with a quiet, absolute finality. I told them no. I told them I would not pay a single dime. I told them I would fight this lawsuit with every breath in my body, and I would expose Chloe for exactly what she was, regardless of who it upset. My mother stopped crying instantly. The desperation in her eyes hardened into a vicious, chilling anger. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and told me I was exactly what Chloe said I was: selfish, dramatic, and determined to ruin everyone else's happiness. My father told me I was a profound disappointment. With matching expressions of absolute disgust, my parents turned their backs on me and walked out the front door, effectively disowning me right there in the hallway. They chose the illusion over the truth, and they chose their abusers over the daughter who had bled for them. But the true devastation did not arrive until early the next morning. I was in the guest room, quietly packing my bags to move into an extended stay motel, when two uniformed police officers knocked on the front door. David answered it, stepping aside, as they walked directly toward my room. One of the officers handed me a freshly printed legal document. It was an emergency temporary restraining order. Chloe had taken her fraudulent claims to a judge the previous afternoon. She had sworn under oath that my refusal to pay her settlement demands had caused me to become aggressively unhinged. She claimed my military PTSD had been triggered, and I was an immediate physical threat to her and to Leo. Based solely on her fabricated testimony, the judge had granted the order. I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Chloe David or my nephew. The officers informed me I had 10 minutes to gather my belongings and vacate the premises immediately. I did not argue with the police. They were just doing their job. I zipped up my duffel bag with trembling hands, but as I walked down the hallway toward the front door, escorted by the officers, I heard Leo crying from his bedroom. He was calling out for me. It was time for his morning bandage change, a process that required meticulous care and gentle patience. Chloe was standing at the end of the hall, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She was willing to let her son suffer through improper medical care, willing to let his skin grafts tighten and tear, just to punish me and win her game of control. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as the heavy front door closed behind me, cutting off the sound of my nephew's frightened voice. I stood on the sidewalk in the cool morning air, clutching my single bag, locked out of the only family I had ever known. Chloe had taken my money, she had taken my parents, and now she had weaponized the legal system to rip me away from the child I loved more than life itself. She thought she had broken me. She thought she had won. But as I walked toward my car, dialing the number of a local law firm, she had no idea that she had just ignited a fire far more dangerous than the one she started on that boat. The moment the heavy oak door closed behind me, locking me out of my brother's house, I felt a familiar coldness settle over my skin. It was the same icy clarity I used to rely on during my deployments in the Navy whenever a sudden crisis erupted. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are actively under fire. Chloe thought she had broken me by dropping a $500,000 lawsuit on my head and securing a fraudulent restraining order to rip me away from my wounded nephew. She expected me to crumble. She expected me to weep in the streets to beg my parents for forgiveness and ultimately to empty my bank accounts just to make the legal pain stop. She was entirely wrong. I did not shed a single tear as I walked to my car in the cool morning air. I put the keys in the ignition, gripped the steering wheel with my bandaged hands, and shifted from being a wounded, betrayed sister into a military tactician. If my family wanted a war, I was going to bring them one. I drove straight to a cheap, extended-stay motel on the outskirts of Tampa. It was a depressing room with flickering fluorescent lights and a bed that smelled faintly of industrial bleach, but it served its purpose as a forward operating base. I set my laptop on the small laminate desk and laid out my arsenal. I spread out the fraudulent court summons, the printed photographs of Chloe's iPad search history, detailing how to stage a marine fire, the text messages she sent to the shady mechanic, and my own medical records documenting the severe burns I had suffered while saving the child she abandoned. I knew I needed legal representation, but not just any standard family lawyer who wanted to charge hourly fees to negotiate a peaceful settlement. I needed a shark. I needed someone who understood that we were not dealing with a misunderstanding. We were dealing with a sociopath. I spent the entire day researching law firms. By late afternoon, I found him. Thomas Sterling was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless litigation firms in the state of Florida. More importantly, before he entered private corporate practice, he had spent a decade serving as a judge advocate general officer in the military. He was a former Navy lawyer. He understood the absolute concept of duty, and he understood exactly how to dismantle a hostile adversary. I called his office the next morning and refused to let his receptionist put me on hold. I stated clearly that I was a decorated Navy veteran facing a fraudulent extortion lawsuit tied to an attempted murder and insurance fraud, and I needed to see Thomas Sterling immediately. 2 hours later, I was sitting in his downtown office. The room smelled of rich leather, expensive coffee, and absolute authority. Thomas Sterling sat across from me at a massive mahogany table. He was in his late 50s with steel gray hair, sharp blue eyes, and a posture so rigidly straight it commanded immediate respect. He wore a custom-tailored suit, but he still carried the distinct, quiet intensity of a military commander. He did not offer me empty sympathy or gentle platitudes. He offered a legal yellow notepad and a pen. I told him everything. I spoke in clean, chronological facts. I detailed the Labor Day boating trip, the explosion, the rescue, and the agonizing weeks I spent in the burn unit. I explained how Chloe had abandoned her son in the water only to later weaponize his trauma to collect charity money and steal my life savings. Then I pushed the heavy manila envelope across the polished table. I told him about the overheard conversation in the garage regarding the denied insurance claim. I watched his eyes narrow as he pulled out the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Chloe's iPad. He read the search queries about staging a marine electrical fire. He read the text messages negotiating the placement of the accelerant. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the reality of the situation crystallized. This was not a standard custody dispute or a simple personal injury claim. My sister-in-law had intentionally poured gasoline into the hull of a boat, knowingly trapping her 5-year-old son and me below deck purely to collect a $150,000 insurance payout. And when that failed, she weaponized the family court system to file a bogus $500,000 lawsuit to silence me and steal my veteran disability money. Thomas set the papers down. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. His expression hardened into something profoundly dangerous. He looked at me, taking in the burn scars that were clearly visible extending past the collar of my shirt. He asked me if I understood the absolute gravity of the evidence I was holding. He said this was no longer civil litigation. This was a criminal conspiracy felony insurance fraud and the reckless endangerment of a child. He told me that Chloe and David were incredibly foolish to try and extort a military veteran who had the discipline to fight back. He formally accepted me as his client on the spot. He told me to go back to my motel, lock the door, and speak to absolutely no one. He promised me we were going to build an ironclad legal shield around me, and then we were going to forge a sword to cut them down. I left his office feeling something I had not felt since the explosion. I felt powerful. Returning to the motel, the physical toll of the morning finally caught up with me. The skin grafts on my back and shoulders burned with a fierce, tight agony, but the physical pain paled in comparison to the agonizing worry I felt for my nephew. Leo was trapped in that house with a mother who had shown she valued a luxury lifestyle over his very life. I lay on the stiff motel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, wondering who was changing his bandages. I wondered if Chloe was letting his healing skin tighten and scar simply because she was too lazy to do the physical therapy I had performed every single day. The thought of him crying out in pain, wondering why his Aunt Sarah had abandoned him, felt like a physical knife twisting in my chest. I had to get him out of there. Over the next 3 days, Thomas moved with terrifying speed. He immediately filed a sweeping response to the frivolous lawsuit, issuing a blanket denial of all charges, while simultaneously filing emergency counter-motions to protect my military pension and remaining bank accounts from being frozen. He established a secure channel of communication and instructed me to forward every single harassing text message my mother and father were sending me. My parents were bombarding my phone, calling me a traitor, demanding I surrender to Chloe's demands to keep the peace. Thomas archived every one of their hostile messages to use as evidence of a coordinated extortion attempt. He was building my legal shield brick by brick, but a shield is only meant to absorb incoming fire. To win this war, we needed to go on the offensive. We needed to know exactly what kind of financial desperation had driven Chloe to commit arson. We needed a deep dive into the darkest corners of their lives. On Thursday morning, I was called back to the law firm. I was escorted into a private conference room where Thomas was sitting with a man named Robert Miller. Robert was a private investigator and a former forensic accountant for the federal government. The large conference table was entirely covered in financial printouts, bank statements, and comprehensive background check reports. Robert began to walk me through the absolute disaster that was my brother and sister-in-law's financial reality. I knew they were irresponsible, but the truth was staggering. Chloe was drowning in a sea of hidden credit card debt spread across 14 different accounts. She had taken out high-interest personal loans to fund her spa retreats and luxury cosmetic procedures. The brand-new luxury SUV she had purchased using the charity money came with an insurance premium she could not afford, and the vehicle was already slated for repossession. They were 4 months behind on the mortgage of their suburban home, and the bank was preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings. The picture became terrifyingly clear. The boat explosion was not just a greedy grab for extra cash. It was an act of desperate survival. Chloe needed that $150,000 by insurance payout to stop the bank from taking her home and to maintain her facade of wealth. When the Marine investigator found the accelerant and denied the claim, her entire house of cards collapsed. That was why they pivoted to me. They saw my veteran disability settlement as their only remaining lifeline. They needed $500,000 and they were willing to destroy my life to get it. But Thomas was not just focused on Chloe. He directed my attention to a separate stack of files concerning the attorney she had hired to sue me. His name was Richard Vance. He was a sleazy, high-volume personal injury lawyer known for aggressive television commercials promising massive settlements. He was the kind of attorney who thrived on fear and intimidation. Thomas explained that Vance did not take cases based on legal merit. He took cases based on the defendant's ability to pay. He had clearly run a background check on me, identified my military pension, my disability settlement, and my spotless credit score, and decided I was a highly profitable target. Vance specialized in filing massive, frivolous lawsuits designed to inflict maximum emotional and financial pressure, forcing innocent people to settle out of court just to avoid the crushing legal fees of a long trial. It was a classic extortion racket, dressed up in a cheap suit and a law degree. But as Robert continued his presentation, the atmosphere in the conference room shifted from analytical to distinctly sinister. Robert pulled up a digital spreadsheet on the large monitor mounted on the wall. He explained that something about Richard Vance's recent track record was deeply unnatural. In the legal world, especially in contentious civil litigation, win rates fluctuate. Even the absolute best attorneys lose cases. But Richard Vance was not the best attorney. He was a bottom feeder with a history of sloppy filings and questionable ethics. Yet, according to the public court records Robert had scraped and compiled, Vance had won his last 14 consecutive cases, 14 massive financial settlements, 14 cases where the opposing counsel had their evidence suppressed, their witnesses discredited, and their clients ordered to pay exorbitant damages. I asked how a lawyer that incompetent could possibly maintain a perfect winning streak in a fair legal system. Thomas leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the mahogany table. He looked at me with a chilling intensity and stated clearly that it was not a fair legal system. Robert highlighted a column on the spreadsheet. Every single one of those 14 cases spanning across different districts and different types of civil litigation had been mysteriously routed through the exact same courtroom. They had all been presided over by one specific family court judge, a judge who consistently overruled legitimate objections against Vance, a judge who consistently denied standard motions from the defense, and a judge who handed down maximum financial penalties that directly benefited Vance's law firm. The blood drained from my face as Thomas handed me the official court docket for my own lawsuit. It was the schedule for my upcoming mandatory mediation and trial dates. I looked down at the assigned presiding magistrate printed in bold black ink at the top of the page. It was the exact same judge. Richard Vance had not just filed a frivolous lawsuit against me, he had filed it in a rigged courtroom. Chloe had not just hired a sleazy lawyer. She had bought her way into a corrupt judicial machine designed to strip me of everything I owned. We were not just fighting my abusive family anymore. We were walking straight into a legal slaughterhouse, orchestrated by a judge who held the power to destroy my life with the single strike of a gavel. And as I stared at the judge's name printed on that official court document, a cold wave of absolute horror washed over me because I suddenly realized exactly why that name was so deeply familiar. Before we stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the towering glass office building in downtown Tampa, Thomas Sterling pulled his car into a shadowed parking structure, turned off the engine, and looked at me with absolute, unyielding authority. He gave me my final briefing for the morning. He told me that today was not about fighting back, arguing facts, or defending my honor. Today was about complete and utter surrender. He instructed me to play the part of a broken, terrified, and defeated veteran who was ready to give up anything just to make the relentless legal nightmare stop. I was wearing a plain, slightly oversized gray knit sweater. It served a highly calculated dual purpose. It hid the rigid, disciplined posture drilled into me by the military, making me look smaller and more fragile. And it comfortably accommodated the thick layers of sterile gauze still wrapped tightly around my healing skin grafts. My arms and back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity that spiked into blinding pain every time I shifted in my seat. The burn unit doctors had given me strict instructions about resting, but I welcomed the physical agony. It kept my mind razor sharp and anchored to reality. Thomas reached across the center console and tapped the digital face of the Apple Watch secured to my left wrist. He reminded me to tap the recording application the exact moment we were left alone in the room with them. He assured me it was entirely legal in this specific, one-party consent setting, provided I was an active participant in the conversation. He had even configured the device to instantly upload the audio file to a secure encrypted cloud server the moment I stopped recording. Even if Chloe noticed and destroyed the watch, the evidence would already be locked in his firm's digital vault. I nodded, taking one deep, steadying breath to center myself, and followed my attorney into the battlefield. The mediation center was located on the 14th floor of a high-rise that overlooked the gray waters of the bay. It was a cold, sterile environment designed to strip away human emotion and reduce complex lives to simple financial transactions. The walls were painted a neutral, depressing beige, and the air smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and cheap, stale coffee. We were directed to Conference Room B by a receptionist who did not even look up from her monitor. As we walked in, Thomas immediately went to work establishing his carefully crafted facade. The ruthless, brilliant former military prosecutor I had met in his office completely vanished. In his place was a slightly disorganized, overwhelmed, and tired attorney who fumbled with the latches of his briefcase and dropped a stack of yellow legal pads onto the polished mahogany table. He was baiting a trap, and he needed the opposition to feel entirely overconfident. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden door swung open and the opposition arrived. Chloe walked into the room, dripping in absolute luxury, a stark contrast to the tragic narrative she was spinning in her legal filings. She wore a tailored white designer blazer, oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled blonde hair, and a pair of red-bottomed leather heels that echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. She carried a customized iced coffee, looking less like a mother traumatized by a horrific boat explosion and more like a minor celebrity arriving at a press conference. She was practically glowing with smug, untouchable satisfaction. David followed closely behind her, carrying her oversized designer handbag like a dutiful servant. He looked slightly uncomfortable, his eyes darting toward the bandages visible at the collar of my sweater, but he quickly looked away and took his seat firmly by his wife's side. He had made his choice, and he was committing to it. Following them was their attorney, Richard Caldwell. He was exactly the kind of bottom-feeding predator the private investigator had described. He wore a shiny, overly expensive pinstripe suit that looked entirely out of place for a Tuesday morning mediation. He carried himself with a greasy, unearned arrogance, practically strutting to the table. When he saw Thomas fumbling with a spilled stack of documents, Caldwell smirked openly. He aggressively threw his leather briefcase onto the table, leaning forward to assert dominance. He introduced himself to Thomas with a condescending tone, clearly believing he was dealing with an amateur family lawyer who was vastly out of his depth. Thomas played his part flawlessly. He offered a nervous, apologetic smile, hastily gathered his papers, and took his seat beside me, looking thoroughly intimidated. I kept my head bowed, staring intently at the grain of the wood on the table, forcing my hands to tremble just slightly in my lap. The mediator arrived a few minutes later. She was a stern older woman who clearly wanted to push this case through the overloaded legal system as quickly as possible. She took her seat at the head of the table, read through the standard confidentiality agreements in a monotone voice, and explained that the goal today was to find a mutually agreeable financial settlement to avoid a lengthy public and costly trial. She turned the floor over to Chloe and her attorney to present their opening statement. What followed was an absolute masterclass in orchestrated theatricality. Chloe did not simply speak. She performed. She pulled a tissue from her designer bag and began to weep on absolute command. She spoke in a trembling, fragile voice about the horrifying trauma of the boat explosion, conveniently omitting the fact that she had poured the accelerant herself. She painted a vivid, entirely fabricated picture of me as an unstable veteran who used the chaos of the fire to assert dominance over her family. She cried as she described the severe emotional distress my presence caused her, claiming she could not sleep, could not eat, and lived in constant paralyzing fear that I would try to kidnap her son under the guise of providing medical care. She actually looked the mediator directly in the eye and said that my military background made me a dangerous, unpredictable threat to her child's physical safety. It took every ounce of military discipline I possessed to remain seated in that chair. My fingernails dug so deeply into my palms that they nearly drew blood. I was listening to the woman who had intentionally poured gasoline into a boat hull, nearly murdering her own 5-year-old child for a fraudulent insurance payout, sit in a sterile office and call me a danger to society. I listened to her weaponize the severe burns on my back, claiming the mere sight of my injuries was causing her profound psychological damage. David sat next to her, rubbing her shoulder comfortingly, playing the role of the supportive husband, protecting his fragile wife. He was silently endorsing every single monstrous lie she told. When her crocodile tears finally subsided, Richard Caldwell took over. He leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and presented their financial demands with brutal precision. He stated that the emotional damage inflicted upon his client was catastrophic and permanent. To settle the matter out of court and drop the emergency restraining order, they were demanding a lump sum of $500,000. But he did not stop there. Knowing perfectly well that I did not have $500,000 in liquid cash, Caldwell laid out a highly specific, ruinous payment structure. They demanded the deed to my modest house, which I had purchased using my hard-earned military loan. They demanded the entirety of my remaining savings account. And most sickening of all, they demanded a legally binding garnishment of my monthly military pension and my veteran disability payments for the next 20 years. They wanted to bleed me dry for the rest of my natural life. Thomas let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of absolute defeat. He looked at Caldwell and pleaded for reason. He stammered that these extreme demands would leave his client completely destitute, bankrupt, and living on the street. He begged for a more reasonable negotiation, playing the role of a desperate, outmatched lawyer, trying to save a sinking ship. Caldwell simply laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound that filled the small room. He told Thomas that reason had nothing to do with the law. He said these were the final terms, and if we did not accept them today, he would personally drag me through a highly publicized trial that would bankrupt me in legal fees alone, before the judge eventually awarded them the exact same amount. The mediator, sensing the rapidly escalating tension and recognizing that no immediate financial agreement was going to be reached, called for a brief recess. She announced she was going to step into her private office to make copies of the proposed settlement terms and review the financial disclosures. She suggested the attorneys step outside into the hallway to discuss the legal logistics of the property transfer without the emotional presence of the clients. Thomas gave me a fleeting, almost imperceptible nod. He stood up, gathered his disorganized papers, and followed Caldwell and the mediator out of the heavy wooden door. David immediately stood up, claiming he urgently needed to use the restroom, and practically bolted from the room. He could not handle the silence. He could not handle looking at the sister he had betrayed without his slick lawyer present to do the talking. The heavy door clicked shut. I was left entirely alone in the large conference room with the woman who had burned my life to the ground. The moment the metal latch engaged the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. The fragile, weeping, traumatized mother vanished instantly. Chloe sat up perfectly straight, dropping the used tissue onto the table with a look of utter disgust. She took a sip of her expensive iced coffee, her face hardening into a mask of pure predatory arrogance. Beneath the table, entirely out of her line of sight, I tapped the digital screen of my Apple Watch. A small red icon appeared. The recording application was active, capturing every single sound in the quiet room. I kept my head bowed, playing my part to perfection. I let my voice crack, forcing a tone of absolute humiliating desperation. I begged her to reconsider. I told her that taking my home and my military pension would leave me with absolutely nothing. I pleaded with her to remember that I had drained my life savings to pay for Leo's skin grafts, that I loved him more than anything, and that I would never do anything to hurt him. I asked her how she could possibly do this to family. Chloe laughed. It was a dark, chilling sound, completely devoid of human empathy. She slowly stood up from her leather chair and walked around the massive mahogany table until she was standing directly beside me. The smell of her heavy, expensive perfume was suffocating. She leaned down, resting her manicured hands on the table, bringing her face mere inches from my ear. She whispered, her voice dripping with vicious, undeniable triumph. She told me to stop whining. She said family was a meaningless word, used by weak people to justify being used. She told me I was nothing but a convenient bank account, a stupid, loyal soldier who had finally outlived her usefulness. She said she was going to take my house, my pension, and every single cent I earned for the rest of my life, because she deserved it, and because I was simply too weak to stop her. I kept my eyes glued to the table, letting my shoulders shake as if I were crying uncontrollably. I asked her how she could be so sure. I asked her what made her think a judge would ever award her my military disability money based on a pile of fabricated lies. Chloe leaned in even closer. I could feel her breath against my neck. She dropped her voice to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper, eager to brag about her brilliant, unbreakable strategy. She wanted me to know exactly how thoroughly I had been defeated. She could not resist the urge to gloat. She told me I could not win. She explicitly stated that fighting the lawsuit was a complete waste of my time. She whispered that the justice system was just another marketplace, and her brilliant lawyer had already bought the winning ticket. With absolute, unvarnished arrogance, she confessed the entire corrupt scheme directly into the microphone resting on my wrist. She said Richard Caldwell had a very special arrangement with the court. She leaned in and whispered the final fatal words of her trap. She said I was going to lose everything because Judge Hayes was a very close friend of her lawyer, and he had already promised to give them exactly what they wanted. I sat perfectly still. I did not breathe. I did not move a single muscle. I just let her words hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the conference room. Chloe smiled, patted me condescendingly on the shoulder, and walked back to her seat just as the heavy wooden door began to open. The mediator and the attorneys walked back and completely oblivious to the confession that had just been permanently digitally recorded and uploaded to a secure server. Richard Caldwell took his seat, adjusting his expensive tie, wearing the exact same arrogant smirk as his client. Thomas sat down beside me, opening his notepad, ready to continue playing the fool. But I was no longer listening to the mediator. I was no longer listening to Caldwell demand my house or my pension. The sound in the room seemed to fade away, entirely replaced by a rushing, roaring noise in my ears. The temperature in my veins turned to absolute ice. The name echoed in my mind over and over again, bouncing off the walls of my memory like a sniper bullet. Judge Hayes. I slowly lifted my head, completely ignoring the throbbing pain in my burned shoulders, and looked blankly at the wall ahead of me. A profound, terrifying chill cascaded down my spine. The disparate pieces of the puzzle did not just fall into place, they slammed together with the violent force of an explosion. The perfect win record Caldwell possessed, the rigged family courtroom, the absolute unwavering certainty in Chloe's voice. I knew that name. I knew it intimately. Before he was a family court judge handing down corrupt civil verdicts in Florida, he had worn a very different title. He was Captain Robert Hayes. He was the negligent, cowardly commanding officer who had ordered my Marine unit into the unreconnoitered valley in Afghanistan. He was the man whose catastrophic failure in leadership had led to the fiery ambush where I had earned my Navy Cross. And more importantly, he was the man who had been forced to resign his military commission in absolute disgrace solely because I had possessed the courage to testify against him during the federal inquiry. Chloe thought she had bribed a random corrupt judge to steal my money. She had absolutely no idea she had just walked me directly into the courtroom of the man who had been waiting nearly a decade to destroy my life. The ride back to Thomas Sterling's office was consumed by a suffocating silence. I sat in the passenger seat of his sedan, watching the gray waters of Tampa Bay flash by the window, my mind locked in a violent collision of past and present. Thomas kept glancing at me, clearly sensing the drastic shift in my demeanor. I had walked into that mediation room as a client fighting a fraudulent family lawsuit. I was walking out as a soldier who had just identified a high-value target. The moment we stepped into his private suite and the heavy glass door sealed shut behind us, the facade of the terrified, defeated veteran I had played all morning vanished completely. I stood perfectly straight, ignoring the agonizing pull of the healing skin grafts across my back, and walked directly to his massive mahogany desk. I told him to pull up the military records database. I told him I needed to see the service history of Judge Robert Hayes, specifically any deployment records attached to the United States Marine Corps operations in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. Thomas did not ask questions. He recognized the absolute chilling certainty in my voice. As a former Judge Advocate General officer, he had immediate access to federal personnel archives. His fingers flew across the keyboard. A few moments later, a digital file appeared on his large monitor. It displayed an official military portrait of a younger man in a crisp uniform. The dark hair was now gray, and the jawline was heavier, but the arrogant, hollow eyes were identical to the ones I saw in my nightmares. It was him. Before he was a corrupt magistrate operating a rigged family court in Florida, he was Captain Robert Hayes. I stood in front of the glowing screen, and the sterile smell of the law office was instantly replaced by the phantom scent of burning diesel and copper. I transported back to a sweltering July afternoon nearly a decade ago. I was a Fleet Marine Force corpsman attached to a forward operating infantry unit. Captain Hayes was our commanding officer. He was an ambitious, deeply arrogant man who viewed his Marines not as human lives, but as stepping stones for his own promotion. He wanted a combat commendation, and he was willing to bypass standard safety protocols to get it. Against the explicit warnings of our local intelligence liaisons, Hayes ordered our convoy directly into an unreconnoitered valley to secure a village that had not been cleared. It was a devastating textbook ambush. The enemy had fortified the high ground on both sides of the narrow pass. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the lead Humvee, flipping it instantly and trapping the crew inside a blazing inferno. The radio network descended into absolute chaos. Men were screaming for orders. Men were bleeding out in the dirt. And our commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes, completely froze. He abandoned the command net cowering in the floorboards of the armored transport vehicle while his unit was being slaughtered. I did not wait for orders that were never going to come. I grabbed my medical kit, ran through a relentless hail of incoming fire, and sprinted toward the burning Humvee. The heat was so intense, it melted the synthetic fibers of my uniform to my skin. I dragged 3 severely wounded Marines out of that wreckage, treating their massive trauma in the dirt while returning fire. That was the day I earned the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. But the medal was a heavy, bitter honor, because those men should never have been in that valley to begin with. When we finally extracted and returned to base, the Department of the Navy launched an immediate Inspector General investigation into the catastrophic failure of leadership. I was called as a primary witness. I sat in a sterile briefing room at Quantico and looked Captain Hayes dead in the eye as I testified against him. I detailed his cowardice, his negligence, and his absolute failure to protect his Marines. Because of my sworn testimony, he was stripped of his command. To avoid the public humiliation of a general court-martial, he was quietly allowed to resign his commission in absolute disgrace. His military career was annihilated, and his reputation was permanently destroyed. I looked away from the monitor and met Thomas's sharp blue eyes. The gravity of the situation settled over the room like a physical weight. Chloe thought she was brilliant. She thought she had hired a sleazy personal injury lawyer with a convenient connection to a corrupt judge who would blindly rule in her favor for a cut of the profits. She had absolutely no idea she had delivered me directly to the executioner's block. Robert Hayes had spent the last 10 years reinventing himself in the civilian sector, climbing the political ladder to become a family court judge. And now the woman who had ruined his life was walking willingly into his courtroom completely at his mercy. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, his expression hardening into a mask of pure tactical calculation. He stated clearly that we were no longer fighting a civil extortion case against a greedy sister-in-law. We were walking into a judicial ambush orchestrated by a man with a decade-old vendetta. Hayes held the power to suppress our evidence, deny our motions, and legally strip me of my military pension, my home, and my dignity. He could accomplish with a wooden gavel exactly what he failed to do in the desert. But Thomas was a military man. He smiled a cold, dangerous smile and told me that arrogant commanders always make the same fatal mistake. They always underestimate their enlisted personnel. We were going to court. The morning of the trial arrived with a heavy, oppressive humidity that hung over the city of Tampa. I did not put on a standard business suit. I did not put on the oversized gray sweater I had worn to the mediation to look small and defeated. I opened my closet and removed the protective plastic from my formal Navy dress uniform. I put it on piece by piece. The crisp white fabric, the polished brass buttons, the immaculate ribbons denoting my deployments, and finally resting heavy and undeniable over my left breast pocket, the Navy Cross. It was not a prop. It was armor. I was stepping back onto a battlefield, and I wanted my enemy to know exactly who he was fighting. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the county courthouse, the bustling lobby came to a sudden noticeable halt. Conversations paused, heads turned. A decorated female combat veteran in full dress uniform was a rare sight in a family court building. Thomas met me near the security checkpoint. He took one look at my uniform, gave a short, approving nod, and handed me my leather portfolio. We walked in stride down the long marble hallway toward courtroom 4. Inside, the atmosphere was already thick with smug anticipation. Chloe was sitting at the plaintiff's table, wearing a demure conservative floral dress, clearly chosen by her lawyer to make her look like a fragile, innocent mother. David sat in the gallery, right behind her, playing the role of the supportive husband. Richard Vance, her attorney, was organizing his files with a greasy, overconfident smirk. When they saw me walk through the swinging wooden gates in full military dress, Chloe's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She leaned over and whispered frantically to Vance. He simply waved his hand dismissively, completely unaware of the historical landmine waiting beneath his feet. The heavy door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff ordered the room to rise. Judge Robert Hayes walked in his black robes, billowing around his heavy frame. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at his docket. He looked bored, annoyed, and entirely ready to rubber stamp another fraudulent settlement for his corrupt associate. Then he lifted his head and scanned the room. His eyes swept past Richard Vance. They swept past Chloe. They landed on the defense table. They landed on me. I was standing at parade rest, my spine perfectly straight, my chin leveled, staring directly into his face. I saw the exact moment the recognition hit him. It was like watching a man touch a live electrical wire. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His hands resting on the polished wood of the bench twitched violently. He blinked clearly, hoping his mind was playing tricks on him, but I did not disappear. The uniform did not disappear. The Navy Cross gleaming under the fluorescent lights did not disappear. The ghost of his ruined career was standing in his courtroom. A dark, venomous red slowly crept up his neck, staining his cheeks with absolute, unrestrained fury. The fear vanished instantly, replaced by the malicious realization of his own power. He gripped his wooden gavel and slammed it down with unnecessary deafening force to call the court to order. the air in the room turned to ice. From the very first minute, the bias was not just evident, it was a blatant aggressive assault. Thomas stood up to submit our preliminary evidence package. He attempted to enter the high-resolution photographs of Chloe's iPad search history, the texts to the mechanic proving the boat explosion was intentional arson. Before Thomas could even finish his sentence, Richard Vance stood up and offered a weak, entirely baseless objection regarding chain of custody. Judge Hayes did not even look at the legal brief. He sustained the objection, immediately striking our most crucial piece of evidence from the record. When Thomas tried to introduce the medical files proving my burns were sustained, saving a child that Chloe had abandoned, Hayes interrupted him mid-sentence. He accused Thomas of wasting the court's time with irrelevant medical history and threatened him with contempt if he continued to stray from the narrow scope of the emotional distress claim. For the next 2 hours, the courtroom became a slaughterhouse. Hayes systematically dismantled our defense. Every minor, frivolous objection Vance raised was sustained. Every legitimate legal motion Thomas filed was aggressively denied. Hayes allowed Chloe to take the stand and deliver a weeping, entirely fabricated monologue about how my military background made me a violent, unstable presence in her home. He allowed her to claim that the burns on my body terrified her son intentionally, twisting my sacrifice into a weapon of abuse. I sat at the defense table, my face a mask of absolute calm, taking the incoming fire just as I had in that valley a decade ago. But internally, the reality of the trap was terrifying. Hayes was not just ruling against me, he was enjoying it. He leaned forward over the bench, resting his forearms on the wood, and stared directly at me while he sustained another objection. There was a cruel, triumphant gleam in his eye. He was determined to use this civil case to destroy my life, to strip away my assets, and to label me a danger to society. He thought he had me cornered. He thought his black robe made him invincible. He was entirely ready to exact his revenge, completely unaware that Thomas and I were just waiting for him to make one final, fatal mistake. The afternoon session commenced with a suffocating heaviness that seemed to drain the oxygen directly from the room. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing us inside a space that felt less like a hall of justice and more like an execution chamber. The bailiff called the court to order, and Richard Caldwell, the sleazy personal injury attorney my sister-in-law had hired, immediately called his star witness to the stand. Chloe did not walk to the front of the room. She floated. She had clearly spent hours preparing for this exact performance, abandoning her usual display of aggressive luxury brands for a plain pale blue cardigan and a modest knee-length skirt. She looked fragile, exhausted, and entirely manufactured. She took the oath with a trembling hand, sat down in the wooden witness box, and looked out at the gallery with wide, fearful eyes. What followed was an absolute masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. Richard approached the podium with a sickeningly gentle smile, asking her to recount the events of the Labor Day boating trip. Chloe sat under the harsh fluorescent lights and began to weep on absolute command. She testified that the boat engine had malfunctioned without warning, creating a small, manageable fire. But she did not stop at simply lying about the explosion. She went straight for the throat, weaponizing my military service and twisting my sacrifice into a weapon of abuse. She looked directly at Judge Hayes, her voice shaking with perfectly rehearsed terror, and claimed that the sudden loud noise of the engine popping had triggered a severe, violent psychological breakdown in me. She stated under oath that my combat trauma caused me to hallucinate, turning a simple boat fire into a violent war zone in my mind. According to her completely fabricated narrative, she and David had tried to safely evacuate everyone from the vessel, but I had aggressively shoved them out of the way in a manic frenzy. She openly wept as she told the court that I had violently grabbed her 5-year-old son, dragging him unnecessarily through the flames, intentionally exposing him to the fire, simply to satisfy a twisted, deeply disturbed hero complex. She actually looked toward the gallery, locking eyes with my mother and father, who were sitting in the second row. She told the court that ever since I returned from Afghanistan, I was a dangerous liability, a ticking time bomb desperate for validation. She claimed my presence in her home after the accident was a reign of terror. She said I used my severe burn injuries to emotionally blackmail the family, forcing them to wait on me hand and foot, and that my nephew was paralyzed with fear every time the unstable veteran walked into his bedroom. I sat at the defense table next to Thomas. My spine was perfectly straight. My hands were folded quietly in my lap, resting over the heavy fabric of my uniform. I did not shake my head. I did not shout that she was a liar. I absorbed every single venomous word with the cold, detached discipline I had learned in the military. I could feel the eyes of the gallery burning into the back of my neck. My parents were actually nodding along, with her testimony dabbing their eyes, with tissues fully endorsing the character assassination of their own daughter, just to protect their golden child. Judge Hayes leaned forward over his elevated bench, resting his chin on his folded hands, listening to Chloe with an expression of deep, manufactured sympathy. He sustained every single leading question Richard asked, allowing him to feed Chloe her lines. He permitted her to ramble for 30 minutes without a single interruption, letting her paint me as a monster in open court. When Richard finally concluded his direct examination, Thomas stood up. He did not attack her aggressively. He asked simple, piercing questions about the denied insurance claim, about the timeline of the fire, and about the exact positioning of the fuel lines. Chloe immediately became defensive, her fragile victim persona cracking under the pressure of basic logic. But she did not need to defend herself, because Judge Hayes did it for her. Every time Thomas backed her into a corner, Hayes would slam his wooden gavel and sustain an objection that Richard had barely finished voicing. He struck Thomas's questions from the record, accusing my attorney of badgering a traumatized mother. The bias was so absolute, so aggressively blatant, that even the court reporter looked up from her typing with a deeply uncomfortable expression. Then it was my turn. The bailiff called my name loudly across the room. I stood up from the defense table. I was not wearing a pastel blouse or a victim's oversized sweater. I was wearing my formal United States Navy dress uniform. The stark white fabric was immaculate, pressed into sharp, unyielding lines. The brass buttons were polished to a mirror shine, catching the overhead lights. The service ribbons rested perfectly above my left breast pocket, detailing every deployment and every campaign. And pinned securely at the top, heavy and undeniable, was the Navy Cross. As I walked across the room toward the witness stand, the absolute silence in the gallery was deafening. The crisp, rhythmic sound of my uniform shoes hitting the hardwood floor echoed off the paneled walls. I stepped into the witness box, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the truth. When I sat down and looked out at the room, my eyes locked immediately onto Judge Hayes. He was staring at me, and the hatred radiating from him was a physical force in the room. His face had flushed a dark, angry red. He was breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring with every exhalation. He was not looking at a civilian defendant in a family court matter. He was looking at the enlisted woman who had stood in a federal tribunal a decade ago and dismantled his entire military career with the uncompromising truth. He hated my posture. He hated my unyielding composure. But more than anything else in the world, he hated that uniform. Thomas approached the podium to begin my direct examination. He started with the absolute facts: my name, my rank, my service record, and my medical training as a trauma nurse. He asked me to describe the moments leading up to the explosion on the boat. I spoke in clear, measured tones. I did not exaggerate the danger, and I did not weep for sympathy. I provided a tactical, chronological account of the distinct smell of gasoline in the lower cabin, the sudden ignition, the immediate wall of fire blocking the exit, and the undeniable fact that Chloe and David had abandoned the vessel instantly without ever attempting to secure their trapped son. Richard was on his feet every 30 seconds, shouting aggressive objections. He claimed hearsay speculation and lack of foundation. Judge Hayes sustained every single one of them with a violent strike of his gavel. Thomas tried to introduce my official hospital medical records into evidence to prove the severity of the third-degree burns I sustained while shielding Leo's body with my own. Judge Hayes flatly refused to admit them. He struck the medical files from the record, claiming they were overly prejudicial and completely irrelevant to the emotional distress claims filed by the plaintiff. The courtroom was rapidly deteriorating into a rigged theater, a corrupt machine designed solely to humiliate me, strip me of my assets, and grant Chloe her fraudulent payout. But as I continued to answer Thomas's carefully worded questions, projecting my voice clearly across the large room, I noticed something volatile shifting in Judge Hayes. My absolute refusal to break was infuriating him. He wanted me to lose my temper. He wanted me to yell, to cry, to act exactly like the unstable, traumatized veteran Chloe had just described. He wanted a reaction he could legally punish. When Thomas asked me to explain the exact physical procedure I used to extract Leo from the burning cabin, I took a deep breath and began to describe the reality of carrying a child through a flash fire. I did not get to finish my sentence. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block with the deafening force of a gunshot. The sharp, violent crack echoed off the high ceiling, cutting my words off instantly. Judge Hayes leaned entirely over the bench, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unvarnished contempt. His black robes flared out around his broad shoulders, making him look like a predator preparing to strike. His eyes bypassed my face completely and locked directly onto the left side of my chest. "Remove that medal, Ms. Myers." His voice did not just fill the room. It vibrated with a vicious, mocking authority. The command was so sudden, so profoundly disrespectful, that the entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. I heard my mother gasp softly in the gallery behind me. Even Richard, the sleazy attorney who thrived on courtroom chaos and intimidation, looked momentarily stunned. His mouth hanging slightly open. I sat perfectly still. I looked up at the judge, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact, and asked him to repeat the instruction to ensure it was properly captured on the official court transcript by the stenographer. Hayes gripped his gavel so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. He leaned closer to the small microphone on his desk, his voice dripping with condescension and pure malice. He stated loudly, clearly, and on the permanent legal record, that this courtroom was not a theater for me to flaunt military props to garner unearned sympathy from his bench. He commanded me to remove the medal, immediately threatening that if I hesitated for even a second, he would hold me in criminal contempt, throw me in a holding cell, and have the armed bailiff physically strip the commendation from my uniform. The absolute disrespect sent a shockwave through the courtroom. The Navy Cross is not a prop. It is the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded to a member of the United States Navy or Marine Corps. It is a sacred commendation earned through blood, immense sacrifice, and the absolute willingness to lay down your own life to save another human being. To call it a theatrical prop was a profound insult, not just to me, but to every service member who had ever bled in the uniform. Judge Hayes knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to strip away my armor. He was trying to force me to submit to his corrupt authority, to humiliate me publicly in front of my abusive family, and to exact his petty, long-awaited revenge for the career I had rightfully taken from him a decade ago in Afghanistan. I glanced briefly at the plaintiff's table. Chloe was sitting there with a triumphant, wicked smile spreading across her perfectly contoured face. She leaned back in her leather chair, crossing her arms, absolutely delighted to watch a judge tear me down and humiliate me. She fully believed her lies and her corrupt legal maneuvering had bought her an untouchable victory. I did not argue the order. I did not shout about my constitutional rights or disrespect the decorum of the court. In the military, you learn a vital lesson very early on. When an enemy commander reveals their true, arrogant nature, you do not interrupt them. You let them expose themselves completely to the light. I raised my hands slowly and deliberately. My fingers brushed against the polished bronze of the Navy Cross. I carefully unclasped the heavy pin from the pristine white fabric of my dress uniform. The metal felt cold against my skin. I brought my hand down and placed the metal gently on the solid oak ledge of the witness stand. The heavy, distinct clink of the metal against the wood was the only sound in the dead silent room. I lowered my hands back to my lap, resting them quietly over my knees. I did not look down at the table. I kept my head leveled, my posture rigid, and I looked Robert Hayes dead in the eye. I stared at him with the exact same cold, analytical gaze I had used when I testified against him in front of the Federal Inquiry Board. The unspoken message in my eyes was absolute and undeniable. You can force me to take off the medal, but you can never take away the courage it represents, and you will never, ever wash away the cowardice that destroyed your own life. Judge Hayes leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a smug, deeply satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He adjusted his black robes, looking incredibly proud of his small, vindictive victory. He thought he had won the war. He thought he had successfully stripped me of my dignity, my credibility, and my honor. He fully believed he was the most powerful man in the room, completely untouchable behind his elevated wooden bench. He was entirely unaware of what was happening 20 feet to my left. At the defense table, Thomas Sterling had not objected to the judge's outrageous demand. He had not stood up to argue case law, cite military regulations, or dramatically defend my honor to the gallery. Instead, while the entire room was entirely focused on my hands removing the medal from my chest, Thomas had quietly reached into his open leather briefcase. Beneath the shadow of the heavy mahogany table, entirely out of the line of sight of the judge and the opposing counsel, Thomas picked up his secure cellular phone. He did not look down at the screen. He did not change his defeated, overwhelmed facial expression. He simply pressed a single pre-programmed button, sending a silent, encrypted text message out of the building. It was a message giving the final, irrevocable green light to the federal investigators who were waiting quietly in unmarked vehicles just down the street, ready to move in and tear this entire corrupt courtroom to the ground. The metallic clink of my Navy cross hitting the solid oak ledge of the witness stand echoed through the dead silent courtroom. I kept my hands folded in my lap, and my eyes locked perfectly on Judge Robert Hayes. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair with a smug, deeply satisfied smile playing across his face. He fully believed he had just stripped me of my dignity and asserted his absolute dominance in front of my abusive family. He thought he had broken me. He thought the trial was essentially over. He was entirely unaware that he had just handed my attorney the exact tactical opening we had been waiting for all morning. Thomas Sterling stood up from the defense table. The hesitant, overwhelmed family lawyer routine he had been playing all week completely evaporated into the stale air of the courtroom. He did not fumble with his legal pads. He did not offer an apologetic smile to the bench. He stood perfectly straight, radiating the cold, ruthless authority of a veteran military prosecutor, preparing to dismantle a hostile target. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase, retrieved a thick manila envelope secured with red wax, and walked slowly toward the center of the room. Thomas addressed the court with a voice that carried an undeniable razor-sharp edge of command. He stated that since the plaintiff and her counsel had formally made my military service record a central component of this civil dispute, specifically alleging that my combat experience made me a psychological threat to my nephew, the defense was now legally obligated to submit the complete federal context of that service. Richard Vance, my sister-in-law's sleazy attorney, jumped to his feet immediately. His greasy arrogance was replaced by a sudden, frantic energy. He shouted a rapid-fire objection, waving his hands dismissively. He claimed that my military history was only relevant to establish my current mental instability as it pertained to his client's emotional distress, and that any further historical documentation was highly prejudicial and an absolute waste of the court's valuable time. Judge Hayes gripped his wooden gavel, his face flushing with a renewed venomous anger. He did not want my service record examined closely under bright lights. He only wanted it used as a blunt weapon against me. He glared at Thomas and sustained the objection with a sharp crack of the gavel before Vance had even finished his sentence. He ordered Thomas to sit down, threatening to hold him in civil contempt and strike my entire defense testimony from the official record if we continued to stray from the narrow parameters he had established. Thomas did not retreat a single inch. He stood his ground in the center aisle, holding the thick envelope up so everyone in the room could see the tamper-evident federal seal stamped across the flap. He looked directly at Judge Hayes and stated with absolute chilling calm that the family court bench did not possess the jurisdictional authority to suppress this specific piece of evidence. Hayes leaned entirely over his elevated desk, his eyes narrowing into furious slits. The veins in his neck bulged against his white collar. He demanded to know what gave a private civil attorney the sheer audacity to lecture a sitting magistrate on jurisdictional boundaries in his own courtroom. Thomas did not raise his voice. He simply cited a specific federal mandate. He stated that under the Classified Information Procedures Act and a direct unsealing order secured early this morning from the Department of the Navy, Inspector General federal evidence pertaining directly to the judicial conduct of a former commissioned military officer cannot be suppressed in any civil proceeding. The specific mention of the Inspector General struck Judge Hayes like a physical blow to the chest. The smug, untouchable satisfaction completely drained from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that he had to set his wooden gavel down on the sounding block to hide the shaking. He knew exactly what was inside that sealed envelope. He knew that the ghost he had spent a decade trying to bury deep in the desert sands of Afghanistan had just walked straight into his courtroom. Hayes attempted to regain control, stammering defensively that family court matters were strictly a state jurisdiction. He argued desperately that federal military records had absolutely no legal bearing on a local custody and emotional distress lawsuit. His voice was rising in pitch, cracking under the immense pressure of his own panic. He ordered his armed bailiff to step forward and confiscate the envelope immediately. Thomas took one aggressive step forward, holding the document high. He informed Judge Hayes that interfering with a declassified federal mandate was a severe federal crime. He explicitly warned the judge, ensuring his words were captured cleanly by the court reporter, that if he ordered a county bailiff to touch that federal evidence, he would be committing obstruction of justice and witness tampering on the official court record. The bailiff, a retired local police officer who recognized the absolute danger of a federal jurisdiction dispute, looked from the sweating judge to my unyielding attorney. He saw the federal eagle stamped onto the red wax seal, wisely took a large step backward, and refused to intervene. The courtroom descended into a paralyzing, suffocating tension. My mother and father sat in the gallery, completely bewildered by the sudden, violent shift in the room's power dynamic. Chloe gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table, her eyes darting frantically between her sweating lawyer and the terrified judge, slowly realizing that her carefully orchestrated extortion plot was spinning completely out of control. Hayes was utterly trapped. If he suppressed the federal file, he committed a felony in open court. If he allowed it into evidence, his darkest, most cowardly secret would be exposed to the public. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the dead silent room, and weakly instructed Thomas to proceed desperately, claiming he would only allow the document to be read for a provisional review of relevance. Thomas did not hand the envelope to the judge for a private, quiet review. He broke the red wax seal with a sharp, decisive motion right there in the center of the room. He pulled out a bound stack of papers bearing the official, unmistakable letterhead of the United States Department of the Navy. He immediately began reading the executive summary aloud, ensuring every single word became a permanent part of the public court transcript. It was the unclassified Inspector General investigative report from our catastrophic deployment in the Helmand Province. Thomas read the chilling, blood-soaked details in a clear, unwavering voice that commanded the attention of every soul in the room. He described a highly ambitious, deeply arrogant commanding officer who deliberately ignored explicit regional intelligence warnings and bypassed standard safety protocols solely to secure a personal combat commendation. He described the exact terrifying moment our Marine convoy was ambushed in an unreconnoitered narrow valley. And then, Thomas read the most damning, humiliating sentence of the entire federal inquiry. He stated clearly that Captain Robert Hayes completely abandoned his tactical command network during a hostile engagement, cowardly taking cover in the floorboards of an armored transport vehicle, while his enlisted Marines sustained heavy casualties in a burning Humvee just 50 yards away. The entire courtroom erupted into shocked, breathy gasps. Richard Vance looked at his corrupt friend on the bench with wide, terrified eyes, realizing the man holding the gavel was an absolute fraud. Chloe covered her mouth with her manicured hand, her fragile victim persona shattering under the weight of actual documented trauma. My parents stared at me sitting quietly in the witness box, then looked at the judge. The horrifying reality of what I had truly survived, finally piercing through their stubborn, selfish ignorance. But Thomas was far from finished. He turned a page in the heavy report and continued reading. He stated that the successful extraction and emergency medical rescue of those trapped burning Marines was executed entirely by Fleet Marine Force Corpsman Sarah Myers, who willingly ran through hostile enemy fire and sustained severe third-degree burns to her own body to save her brothers in arms. He read the official citation that awarded me the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. Then Thomas delivered the final fatal blow. He read the ultimate conclusion of the federal tribunal. It stated unequivocally that Captain Robert Hayes was relieved of his command and forced to resign his military commission in absolute permanent disgrace directly because of the sworn witness testimony provided by Corpsman Myers. Thomas lowered the federal report and looked with absolute disgust at the pale, sweating man sitting high on the bench. Thomas stated clearly, for the record, that Judge Hayes harbored a documented decade-old vendetta against the defendant. He formally accused the judge of weaponizing this civil lawsuit, manipulating legal procedures, and intentionally suppressing my legitimate hospital medical records solely to exact personal vindictive revenge against the enlisted woman who had rightfully destroyed his military career. Judge Hayes lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. He grabbed a replacement gavel and slammed it down wildly, screaming that Thomas was in contempt of court. He shouted that the military report was nothing but irrelevant character assassination and had absolutely nothing to do with the financial merits of Chloe's emotional distress lawsuit. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Thomas smiled. It was a cold, predatory, deeply satisfying smile. He looked up at the bench and told the judge that he completely agreed. The military report only proved his malicious motive. The financial records were what proved the actual crime. Thomas reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a second, much thicker binder. He slammed it down onto the defense table with a heavy thud that echoed off the paneled walls. He announced to the room that his private investigator, a former federal forensic accountant, had spent the last 2 weeks meticulously tracking the financial anomalies of Richard Vance's personal injury law firm. Thomas turned his predatory gaze directly to Chloe's sleazy attorney. Richard Vance was now sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he frantically tried to pack his loose files into his briefcase, desperately looking for an exit that did not exist. Thomas revealed to the stunned court that Richard Vance had miraculously won his last 14 consecutive civil cases. And in an impossible statistical anomaly, every single one of those 14 highly lucrative cases had been strategically routed to the exact same courtroom presided over by Judge Robert Hayes. Thomas opened the heavy binder and began listing offshore bank routing numbers and corporate shell entities. He detailed a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar money laundering operation operating right under the county's nose. Every single time Judge Hayes awarded a massive, unjustified financial settlement to Richard Vance's clients, Vance's law firm would quietly route exactly 20% of their contingency fees through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Thomas then produced the irrefutable banking documents, proving that the offshore shell company was directly linked to a domestic, untraceable trust fund owned entirely by the wife of Judge Robert Hayes. Chloe's jaw dropped completely open. She turned to her lawyer, grabbing his arm and demanding to know what was going on, but Vance was completely paralyzed with absolute suffocating fear. Chloe had thought she was brilliantly manipulating the justice system to steal my hard-earned veteran disability money. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. She had absolutely no idea she had blindly hired a lawyer who was actively running a massive judicial racketeering and bribery syndicate, and she had just tied her own fraudulent arson case directly to a major federal conspiracy. Hayes was screaming now, completely unhinged and incoherent. He banged his wooden gavel so hard that the handle actually splintered in his fist. He shrieked for the bailiff out to arrest Thomas Sterling immediately. He demanded the court reporter strike the entire morning session from the official record. He raged that this was his private courtroom, that he was the absolute legal authority in this county, and that no one had the right to question his integrity. But his corrupt authority was already entirely gone. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung violently open. The loud synchronized thud of heavy boots hitting the hardwood floor instantly silenced the judge's frantic, pathetic screaming. I turned in the witness stand, sitting perfectly straight in my uniform, and watched them walk in. 2 federal agents wearing dark suits and bright yellow FBI windbreakers stepped decisively into the gallery. They were closely flanked by 3 armed federal marshals wearing tactical gear, and they were accompanied by a stern-looking woman carrying a leather portfolio who carried the unmistakable posture of a senior prosecutor from the United States Attorney's Office. They did not wait to be recognized by the bench. They did not pause for permission. They walked straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring my stunned, horrified parents, and moving swiftly past Chloe's table. The lead FBI agent locked eyes with Thomas, gave a short confirming nod of profound respect, and then turned his full, undivided attention directly to the disgraced man sitting behind the elevated bench. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom had just swung open, revealing the federal agents. But Thomas Sterling did not even turn around to look at them. He kept his predatory gaze locked entirely on the disgraced man sitting behind the elevated mahogany bench. The arrival of the FBI was the silent, irrevocable signal that the trap had been fully sprung. The federal agents and the senior prosecutor did not march down the aisle screaming orders. They simply stepped inside, closed the heavy doors behind them with a definitive thud, and stood shoulder to shoulder across the back wall, physically sealing the only exit. They were perfectly content to let my attorney finish dismantling the corrupt machine that had tried to consume my life. Thomas reached into his briefcase one final time. He did not pull out another stack of federal documents or banking records. He pulled out a small, heavy black Bluetooth speaker and set it squarely in the middle of the defense table. He synchronized it with his secure cellular phone, his fingers moving with calm, practiced efficiency. Judge Robert Hayes was still hyperventilating on the bench, his face a terrifying shade of mottled purple, his splintered wooden gavel trembling in his fist. He was screaming for the county bailiff to clear the room, to arrest my attorney, to strike everything from the record. Thomas ignored him completely. He pressed a button on his phone and addressed the silent, paralyzed courtroom. He stated clearly for the official record that under the state statute regarding one-party consent, any active participant in a conversation holds the absolute legal right to record that interaction without notifying the opposing party. He looked directly at Chloe, who was sitting at the plaintiff table. Her smug, untouchable arrogance had completely evaporated. She was gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard her knuckles were bone white. Her eyes darted frantically from the black speaker on our table to the federal agents blocking the door. She suddenly realized that her private, triumphant gloating during our mandatory mediation was about to become public, undeniable evidence. Thomas pressed play. The audio recording was crystal clear. It echoed off the high-paneled walls of the courtroom, cutting through the suffocating tension with devastating precision. First came the sound of my own voice intentionally trembling, begging Chloe not to take my home and my military pension. And then came Chloe's response. Her recorded voice dripped with vicious sociopathic delight. She laughed a dark, chilling sound that made my mother gasp loudly in the gallery. Then the undeniable confession blasted through the room for everyone to hear. You cannot win, Sarah. The justice system is just another marketplace, and my brilliant lawyer has already bought the winning ticket. You are going to lose everything because Judge Hayes is a very close friend of my lawyer, and he has already promised to give us exactly what we want. The sheer brazenness of the recorded confession hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Richard Vance, the sleazy personal injury attorney who had orchestrated this entire extortion attempt, let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. He abandoned his client instantly, grabbing his expensive leather briefcase and scrambling out of his chair. He took 2 frantic steps toward the center aisle, desperately trying to flee the room. a federal marshal wearing tactical gear, immediately stepped forward from the back wall, resting his hand casually on his duty belt, and simply shook his head. Vance froze in his tracks, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat, trapped in the nightmare of his own making. Judge Hayes lost whatever fractured grip he still held on his sanity. He began banging the broken handle of his gavel against the sounding block with manic, terrifying force. He screamed that the audio was fabricated, that it was an illegal wiretap, that my attorney was committing treason against the judicial branch. Saliva flew from his lips. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his white shirt beneath his black robes. He was watching his entire life, his freedom, his reputation burned to the ground in front of a live audience. But Thomas was a military man, and military men do not stop an offensive strike when the enemy is merely wounded. They press the advantage until the threat is entirely neutralized. Thomas turned off the speaker and picked up the thick manila folder containing the high-resolution photographs of Chloe's iPad. He did not hand them to the judge. Instead, he walked directly to the center aisle and handed the folder to the federal prosecutor who had just stepped forward to meet him. Thomas announced to the room that this civil trial was nothing but a calculated cover-up. He stated that the plaintiff, Chloe Myers, had not suffered emotional distress from a tragic accident. She was actively concealing felony arson insurance fraud and the attempted murder of her own 5-year-old son. He detailed the exact search history logs, proving Chloe had researched how to stage a marine electrical fire. He read aloud the text messages between Chloe and her shady mechanic, negotiating the exact placement of the highly flammable accelerant near the boat engine. He described how she intentionally ignited the vessel, knowing her child was trapped in the cabin below deck, purely to secure a $150,000 insurance payout to fund her luxury lifestyle. The layers of conflict crashed together with blinding speed. The extortion, the judicial corruption, the arson, all of it converged into a single, undeniable truth. My parents sat in the second row, their faces drained of all color, staring at the golden daughter they had blindly idolized. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, shaking her head back and forth in absolute horror. My father looked physically sick. They were finally seeing the monster they had protected, and they were seeing the profound, sickening reality of what I had sacrificed to save my nephew. Judge Hayes took one look at the federal prosecutor reviewing the arson logs and completely collapsed. The banging of the gavel finally stopped. He slumped back into his high-backed leather chair, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and vacant. The corrupt judicial machine he had operated for a decade had just been violently dismantled in less than 20 minutes. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and profoundly final. The federal prosecutor closed the folder of evidence and walked slowly through the swinging wooden gates that separated the gallery from the court. She was a tall woman with steel gray hair and a presence that commanded instant, unyielding respect. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She looked up at the elevated bench and addressed the disgraced man sitting behind it. "Robert Hayes," she said, her voice cutting through the dead air. "You are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit extortion and judicial corruption." Two FBI agents wearing bright yellow windbreakers bypassed the attorney's tables and marched directly up the wooden steps to the judge's bench. Hayes tried to stand instinctively, puffing out his chest, attempting to invoke the authority of his black robes one final time. He stammered that he was a sitting magistrate, that they lacked the jurisdictional authority to remove him from his own courtroom. The agents did not argue with him. They did not hesitate. One agent grabbed his left arm, spinning him around with forceful efficiency, while the other pulled his right arm behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly across the silent room. They stripped him of his dignity in seconds, marching him down the steps and parading him past the gallery in handcuffs. The ghost of Afghanistan had finally caught up to him. The prosecutor then turned her attention to the plaintiff table. Chloe was hyperventilating, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her designer cardigan slipping off her shoulders. She looked like a cornered animal. Chloe Myers, the prosecutor, stated clearly, "You are under arrest for felony arson insurance fraud, child endangerment, and conspiracy to commit extortion." A second pair of federal agents approached the table. Chloe lost her mind entirely. The fragile, traumatized mother persona vanished, replaced by the selfish, terrified child she truly was. She began to scream hysterically, kicking at the chair, fighting the agents as they reached for her arms. She looked frantically toward the gallery, her eyes wild with panic. "Mom!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "Mom! Do something! Make them stop! Tell them I did not do it!" My mother leaped out of her seat in the gallery, her maternal instincts blindly kicking in despite the overwhelming mountain of evidence she had just witnessed. She rushed toward the wooden gate, screaming that her daughter was innocent, that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that I had manufactured the evidence because I was jealous. A federal marshal instantly blocked her path, raising his hand and ordering her to step back immediately or face obstruction charges. My father grabbed my mother by the shoulders, pulling her back into the aisle, tears streaming down his own face as they watched their perfect golden child aggressively pinned to the table and handcuffed. Chloe continued to thrash and sob as the agents pulled her to her feet, dragging her toward the back doors. David, who had been sitting frozen in the gallery behind his wife, suddenly stood up and tried to quietly slip into the aisle. An FBI agent intercepted him before he took 3 steps. "David Myers," the agent said, producing another pair of handcuffs. "You are being detained as a material accessory to arson and insurance fraud." David did not fight. He simply went limp, his shoulders slumping as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He turned his head and looked directly at me sitting at the defense table. His eyes were wide with pathetic, desperate pleading. He wanted me to save him. He wanted the reliable quiet sister to step in and fix his catastrophic mess one last time. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over my pristine white Navy uniform, and I looked right through him. I offered him absolutely nothing. The federal agents marched the 3 of them out of the courtroom in a single humiliating procession. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sound of Chloe's hysterical screaming. Richard Vance was quietly escorted out a side door by a federal marshal, his head hanging low in absolute disgrace. Within moments, the crowded, chaotic courtroom was practically empty. My parents stood alone in the center aisle of the gallery, completely shattered. They had lost their golden daughter, their beloved son, and the perfect family illusion they had spent decades prioritizing over my well-being. My mother looked at me, her face streaked with mascara, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for an apology that could possibly bridge the massive canyon of betrayal between us. I did not wait to hear it. I stood up from the defense table, gathered my leather portfolio, and turned my back on them. As I walked out of that courthouse and stepped into the blinding Florida sunlight, the heavy, oppressive weight I had carried on my burned shoulders for the past year completely vanished. The corrupt machine was entirely dismantled. The abusers who had tried to extort my life savings were on their way to federal holding cells. But most importantly, the sudden absolute clarity of the situation washed over me. Chloe and David were going to federal prison for a very long time. My parents were financially and emotionally bankrupt, entirely incapable of providing care. I stood on the concrete steps and realized that I was now the only capable, stable family member left. The layers of conflict had burned away, leaving a clear, undeniable path forward. I was going to secure emergency custody of my 5-year-old nephew, and for the first time in his life, Leo was going to be raised in a home where love was not a manipulation tactic, but a promise. 6 months have passed since that morning in the county courthouse. When I look back at the chaotic, explosive moment, those heavy wooden doors swung open and the federal agents marched down the center aisle. It feels like watching a scene from a movie. But the peace I wake up to every single morning in my own home is entirely beautifully real. The corrupt machine that tried to grind my life into dust was completely dismantled, and the fallout was swift, absolute, and merciless. Judge Robert Hayes did not get to quietly resign in disgrace a second time. The federal prosecutor dismantled his entire racketeering syndicate piece by piece. He was formally stripped of his judicial title, disbarred from practicing law in the state of Florida, and his lucrative state pension was completely revoked. He recently pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges of judicial corruption, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion. He is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary waiting for his final sentencing hearing, looking at a minimum of 15 years behind bars. The man who sat high on a mahogany bench and demanded I remove my Medal of Valor to satisfy his own fragile, cowardly ego is now wearing a standard-issue prison uniform, taking orders from corrections officers, and completely stripped of the authority he so deeply abused. My sister-in-law, Chloe, learned very quickly that federal investigators do not care about designer clothes, curated social media tiers, or performed trauma. When the FBI forensic accountants tore into her finances, they found a staggering trail of deception. She was convicted of felony arson insurance fraud and child endangerment. The judge presiding over her criminal trial was absolutely disgusted by the fact that she had intentionally placed her own 5-year-old son in a lethal situation purely to fund a luxury lifestyle. She was sentenced to 10 years in a federal women's correctional facility. There are no spa days there. There are no luxury SUVs. There is only the cold, hard reality of the choices she made. My brother David completely unraveled without Chloe there to direct his life and without me there to fund it. Because he was complicit in the insurance fraud cover-up, he lost his job. He was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy shortly after the trial. The bank foreclosed on their pristine suburban home, and the luxury Lexus SUV was repossessed right out of the driveway. He currently lives in a cramped, cheap apartment on the other side of the state, working a minimum wage retail job to pay off the massive legal restitution he owes the court. My parents tried to reach out to me about 2 months after the arrests. My mother left a weeping, frantic voicemail begging me to help David pay his legal fees, claiming that family needs to stick together during dark times. She actually had the audacity to ask me to dip into my military disability savings to bail out the golden child who had stood by while his wife tried to frame me for child abuse. I did not call her back. I simply blocked her number and changed my locks. They made their choice when they turned their backs on me in that foyer demanding I surrender my life to a sociopath to keep their illusion intact. I have completely severed ties with them, and I have never felt lighter, because the most important victory of all had nothing to do with revenge. It had to do with a little boy who finally got the safe, loving home he deserved. With Chloe in federal prison and David facing criminal accessory charge and bankruptcy, the family court system moved with unprecedented speed. I was immediately granted full permanent legal and physical custody of my nephew Leo. We moved out of the extended stay motel and bought a beautiful, modest house with a large backyard and a big oak tree. Leo is thriving. The resilience of children is an absolutely incredible thing to witness. We finished his specialized physical therapy 3 months ago. The skin grafts on his legs have healed beautifully, leaving only pale, faint lines that do not restrict his movement at all. He runs, he jumps, and he laughs with a bright, unrestrained joy that fills every corner of our new home. The night terrors he used to have about the fire have completely stopped. He knows he is safe. He knows that his Aunt Sarah will never, ever let anything hurt him. My own burns have healed into thick silver scars across my back and shoulders. I do not hide them anymore. I view them as the physical proof of my love for my nephew, a permanent reminder that I walked through fire to bring him home. Last Friday was a milestone I will remember for the rest of my life. It was Leo's kindergarten graduation. The school hosted a beautiful little morning ceremony in the gymnasium. I woke up early, made Leo his favorite blueberry pancakes, and helped him put on his tiny blue graduation cap and gown. He looked so incredibly handsome, his curly brown hair poking out from under the cap, a massive missing tooth smile on his face. Before we left the house, I went into my bedroom and opened the small velvet box sitting on my dresser. Inside rested the Navy Cross. It was the same medal Judge Hayes had sneeringly ordered me to remove from my uniform, calling it a theatrical prop. I took the heavy bronze medal out of the box. I was not wearing my formal military dress uniform. I was wearing a simple, elegant floral summer dress. I carefully pinned the Navy Cross right over my heart. When I walked into the gymnasium holding Leo's hand, the medal caught the morning sunlight. I did not wear it to boast, and I did not wear it for the approval of strangers. I wore it for me, and I wore it for Leo. When he walked across that small stage to receive his kindergarten diploma, he looked out into the crowd of parents. His eyes searched frantically for a second before they locked onto me. I stood up, smiling with tears in my eyes, the Navy Cross gleaming on my chest. He beamed, waving frantically at me, completely secure in the knowledge that his hero was sitting right there in the front row, cheering the loudest. It was the most profound, deeply healing moment of my entire life. Looking back at the nightmare of the past year, I have done a lot of reflecting on how I ended up being exploited so deeply by the people who shared my blood. I know there are people listening to this right now who have spent decades playing the reliable, quiet problem solver in their own families. You are the one who pays the bills when the golden child messes up. You are the one who hosts the holidays, does the heavy lifting, and absorbs the emotional abuse just to keep the peace. You have been conditioned to believe that family loyalty means setting yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. I want you to hear this clearly. Do not ever let abusers, manipulators, or corrupt authority figures dictate your worth. It does not matter if the person trying to break you wears the title of mother, father, brother, or even the black robe of a judge. A title without character is just an empty word. For years, I believed that because I was the capable, independent veteran, it was my duty to absorb the damage my brother and sister-in-law caused. I thought my silence was an act of noble sacrifice. It was not. My silence was simply providing them with the resources to continue their abuse. We are taught that drawing a line in the sand is an act of cruelty. We are made to feel guilty for protecting our peace, our finances, and our dignity. But boundaries are not an act of aggression. Boundaries are your armor. When you finally stand up and refuse to be the family ATM, when you refuse to be the scapegoat for someone else's toxic behavior, they will inevitably accuse you of tearing the family apart. Let them. You are not destroying a family. You are simply dismantling an extortion racket that relied entirely on your submission. True family has absolutely nothing to do with sharing a last name or a genetic bloodline. Blood will sit in a gallery and watch you be falsely accused of child abuse. Blood will demand you hand over your military pension to a sociopath to avoid an uncomfortable holiday dinner. True family is about action. It is about who stands by your side when the flames are rising. It is about who protects the innocent, who values the truth, and who loves you for your character, not for what they can extract from your bank account. My real family is sitting in my living room right now, building a giant tower out of colorful plastic blocks. My real family is the brilliant attorney who believed my story and stood fearlessly against a corrupt judge. My family is the community of honest, decent people I have chosen to surround myself with. I survived the fire on that boat, and I survived the judicial ambush in that courtroom. Not because I was willing to surrender, but because I finally recognized my own value. You have that same strength inside of you. You do not have to accept the narrative that your abusers have written for you. You have the absolute right to demand respect, to protect your assets, and to walk away from anyone who views your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. When you strip away the guilt and step into your own power, you will realize that the people who tried to break you were actually terrified of how strong you truly are. If you believe that real heroes don't wear capes and that the truth always comes to light, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love hearing from you all. Until next time, stay strong and guard your peace.